Good morning. I wanted to come in today and make sure that everybody has access to my other account and is able to follow on my other account as my pro-Palestine stance seems to be causing a lot of drama on my account. And as you know, I've been pretty close to being booted out since day one. And so it's getting a little bit closer. So if you are wanting to make sure that you can still follow me, my backup account is the A Widda Ord account there. Of course, I'm also still over on YouTube, and you're more than welcome to follow me there as well. But giving us the ability to ensure that you can still find me and still find access to my information. I wanted to make sure everybody had my TikTok backup account. I'm trying to make sure that this gets out to everybody as well. Of course, as per usual, the topics of conversations in here are their own. And this has kind of been what we've been working with for the last couple of days for topics, other than, of course, the fact that there is an ongoing genocide. Well, let me do it that way. Okay, so let me see if I can do it. Stickers. Okay. There we go. Hello, Atira. Thank you so much for last night's conversation. It was extremely helpful for me. I want you to know that. So I am facing being booted off of TikTok. Apparently, that stance is not exactly right-wing trolls. It's just kind of how it is, unfortunately, in our world. And so TikTok absolutely can support those who are doing the harassment and bullying way more than they can support those who are not half the time. So I just want everybody to know that there is the backup account on here. It's not at 1,000 yet, so we'll not be able to go live until it gets to 1,000. It's only like 143. YouTube is still going to be able to go live, but if I am no longer able to go live via this account, I will be able to go live via YouTube, and you can find me on my backup account here, which is the Sarah Widda account. You got to just hand it to people who are that kind, It's really hard for me to understand why people are pro killing children to the point that they are going to attack others. Unfortunately, though, I'm also very well aware of how humanity has, adjusted and changed. Yes, there's I've come into 2 or 3 videos reported every day, and half of them, of course, I win back. I've lost 2 so far. But the whole time that I have been on TikTok, I have been like one step away from TikTok perma-banning me, right? Like they've taken away my lives 2 or 3 times, and I've had to get my lives back. So it's quite possible of perma taking away the account. And it's like, you've got they've got like strikes now. And so I've got several strikes against me now. And so it could possibly be, it could possibly be that it doesn't. It could possibly be that I pull through and I make it through and we don't end up going anywhere. But it could possibly be that we have to switch up accounts, or that I have to talk to TikTok directly a couple more times. So um what happens when we eat the rich? So personally, I'm not going to be partaking because I believe that when you eat something, you imbue its spirit, and I'm not imbuing that spirit. The idea of eat the rich isn't necessarily about eating the rich. It is more about the fact that we have people who are hoarding to the point that other people are starving. And when you have people who are starving and children who are starving and children who can't eat, well, you have people that are hoarding, maybe the hoarders become the fodder, right? And a lot of that is really what that thought process entails. We hear a lot of conversation about eat the rich, and I'm not going to lie, I know people who are down for the food, right? Personally, myself, though, I find that when we eat something, we imbue its spirit. And the last thing that I want to imbue the spirit of is that kind of a human being, because people who can hoard wealth to the expense of other people's lives, to me, are not healthy people. And so I'm definitely not really myself going to go eat. I still, still support those who are on that track, though. Still support those who are on the track of overthrowing those who are hoarding at the expense of children, right? Who are hoarding at the expense of people being able to live in any form of comfort, right? Allah is God and Yahweh. They're all the same fucking deity. And he would really rather you still, well, actually, he probably wouldn't. He is a God of death and destruction and war. Like, he's a hateful God. So he's probably down with all the genocide y'all committing in his name. That's what he does. Um, so that can't be correct because pigs and cows are good spirits, and so many Americans eat those. That's actually pretty factual. Uh, and I would have to agree that most pigs and cows are really good spirits, though the lives that most Americans put them through probably taint that spirit just a little bit, and that tainting is probably what's being imbibed by most Americans, right? Um, it doesn't it's hard to maintain a positive and beautiful spirit when you are locked into a cell that's not long enough for you to actually move around in, right? And so maybe some of the actual issues that we have as Americans is we keep imbuing the spirits of animals that we are traumatizing, right? Gender roles in themselves are toxic. In the timeline of humanity, gender roles are an extremely new thing. They're not something that we've seen throughout human history. And gender roles in themselves are very toxic. The idea that only men do some things and only women do some things is an extremely toxic idea, right? So that's how gender roles are toxic. No, morality isn't subject. Ethics isn't subject. Your idea of what ethics and moral might be isn't subject is subject, but what is moral and what is right is not subject. Now, your idea of whether or not other people should have sex, that's subject, right? But basic human decency, that's not subject. That's basic humanity. That's not subject. That's never been subject. We all want to subjectify it, and we all want to make it subject so that we can do things like Israel killing Palestinian children. But it is not subject. It is something that we create to be subject because it eases our mind as we commit atrocities. It is still not subject. Basic human decency is basic human decency. Basic human decency ensures that everybody eats, that everybody breathes, that everybody has water, and everybody has a safe space to live. That's basic human decency. That has never been subject. Never been subject. People make it subject to fit their own end goals because they have their own issues, but it is not subject. No, it's not subjective. Food, water, safe space. That's not subject. Keeping children safe. That's not subject. It's not. Now, you may make it subject, and you may try to find a way around the immorality of it, but it is not subject. Safe space is a new concept, but having safety is not. And I am not talking about safe space as in, Oh my God, I need a safe space. I'm talking about having a home and a roof over your head that's stable. That is a safe space. And that's not subject. That's basic. That's basic. No, you don't create your own. That's why you have a community. Community creates that. Nobody can create it on their own. It's a communal thing. No, but it is everybody's moral obligation to ensure that children have the basic decence, have basics. That is everybody's obligation. For species continuation, it is everybody's obligation to have the continuation of the species in mind, right? So if we are going to continue as a species and maintain our species, if we're not going to kill ourselves off as a species, which we're trying to do right now, if we are going to maintain species as a whole, it is everybody's responsibility to ensure that the next generation lives. That's it. Because your so basic morals, basic human decency is not subjective. Again, basic human decency is not subjective. Your idea of whether or not people should have sex with other people, that's subjective. But the basic human decency of everybody gets food, everybody gets water, and everybody has a safe space to live is not subjective. That's basic morals and ethics. And yeah, I think there's a difference in what morals is and what's ethics is, but the basic is human decency. Everybody has food, everybody has water, everybody has a safe space, right? You just don't understand what decolonization is, Robert. That's okay. Yeah. I don't care about deeming other people's morals wrong or right. That's not my job. The thought process that it's somebody's job is a problem, right? That's not a problem. Yet there are still basic morals and basic ethics. Part of those basic morals and basic ethics is not inflicting your ideas on another person, right? Life is not free because of our society, not because of anything else, but life itself is supposed to be free. It's guaranteed, it's a right. Drivers, where am I trying to dictate morals for another community other than stop killing children? No, I'm not. First of all, I'm not dictating other people's morals. I am stating that basic human decency is these things. Basic, right? That's not a circular answer. It's a direct answer, in fact. Um, I am asking you where the fuck you think that I decided that I get to define other people's morals outside of the basic human decency. Um, right? I didn't see your question, so I can't answer it. Yeah, China can eat all the dogs they want. It's not my job to tell China they can't eat dogs. Again, I'm not telling you what your morals and values should be. I'm telling you what basic human decency should be. And only because you asked. So let's go ahead and go through the list. Let's start with toxic gender roles because that seems to be on everybody's fucking mind, and that's okay. So, gender is a social and colonial construct. It is not something that we think of before society thinks it. It is not who we are. And it is really all about who you are in your brain. Gender is how you identify. Now, to have a gender role has to be created by the society. The idea of the role of a female is something that is created by society, right? There is no basic role for a woman compared to a basic role for a man. What we have is things that sing to us, talents that work for us, things that work well for us. So when we it's not genetics, that's biological sex. There's a difference between biological sex, of which there are three biological sexes, and gender, which has to do with perception and has to do with internal thought. Oh my God. So when we're looking at gender roles, what we are looking at is something that's been created by society. And gender roles are something that was created by society way more recently. And many of you don't realize exactly how gender roles started or what they were. Many of you don't realize things like heels were invented by and for men, makeup was invented by and for men, lace, pink, velvet, all of these things are by and for men originally. All of these things have nothing to do with females to start off with. And all of these things at their start aren't able to be worn by women because they are created by and for men. Heels are actually something that are created to give men more height. And they were actually created before the stirrup, though the stirrup actually has a lot of weight on why heels come into play. Um, or why heels are used as frequently as they are. But heels are something that is created for men to start off with to make men taller, men who feel the need to be taller. We see the same thing with things like makeup. Makeup's first usages are for identity. And we see painting of the body and decoration of the body. Now, this early decoration of the body is something that is used as an identity marker for everybody because at this point of time, we don't have gender roles. We don't have an idea of gender. Yet, as we move down into a time and a space where gender and gender roles start to come into play, that time and that space when gender and gender roles start to come into play, makeup is something that is used as an aggressor. Makeup is something that is used to scare people, right? To make people like fear you on the field, right? And so makeup in itself starts as a masculine thing. The same thing with pink, purple. These are things that are hard to actually achieve in early dyes. Purple is one of those things that you have to have specific, like, there's very specific animals on this planet that give off the dye for the color purple, and they're rare. And so purple dye originally, that's the reason purple is something that is a royal color, is because it is one of those things that to get you have to spend a whole lot of fucking time and money. And so pink is another one of those things. Pink is something that you get. There's a couple of different dyes that are natural dyes that will do pink, but you have to like go through several different dye stages to get to pink. So you might dye your reds first, and then you might dye, your darker this or your lighter that, so you get to the stage where you're able to dye pink. Because of these things, we see that these are colors that are used primarily by men in the beginning, and they're colors that have a denotion of rank in the beginning. We see the same thing with velvets. We see the same thing with brocades. In every other species on the planet, we see that it is the masculine of the species that peacocks, right? The masculine of the species that has the display. And the reason that the masculine of the species has this bright display is twofold. One of these is to get other, men to understand that you're scary and you're big. If I have a big, scary tail with all my pretty, shiny, bright feathers, you might back off a little bit. And the other one is to ensure that women are attracted to you. So peacocking, being bright and shiny with pretty beautiful colors and high heels and lace and brocade, these are all things that we see that the masculine of the species and other species do. And so this is something that the masculine within our species copies. This is why all of these things start out as masculine instead of starting out as feminine. And yet today we see almost all of these things as feminine. So our idea of gender being conforming to specific things has switched over the time period, has changed and morphed over time. And this is what we talk about when we talk about gender roles. The other thing that we have to look at is that prehistory, there is no concept of gender. Everything within archaeology shows us a lack of concept of gender. We also need to look at the thought process that within early history, history is a written word. So within early history, we see that women rule any space as much as men rule any space. Our very first author is a woman. There are 17 women who were queens in their own right in the Egyptian roles of kings. Early rulers within different parts of Mesopotamia, different parts of the Fertile Crescent, different parts of these oldest civilizations are as many times women as they are men. There is not this idea that men rule and women drool. That's just not how it goes. So we see that prehistory, what is going on prehistory, women are hunting as much as men are hunting. Women are partaking in the different things that you might associate as being masculine things as much as the men are, if not more. Biologically, we are nurturing and communal as a species, which means that we all must nurture and we all must be a part of community. And that has nothing to do with whether or not you have a penis or a vagina. It is everybody must nurture. Now, biologically, we have three sexes, not two. You are not male or female. You are male, female, or intersex. And you might not even know if you're intersex. Intersex is roughly 2% of our population. That's the same percentage, though not the same people, as redhead people and green eyed people. These percentages of our population, though, are a little bit less obvious because intersex is a little bit less obvious. We see that when we get to the concept of gender as opposed to the concept of biological sex, that gender has to do with thought process within the head. Gender has to do with who you are. Gender has to do with how you identify yourself to other people. So you can look at me and you can see somebody who obviously has tits and a vagina. So therefore, I must be female in your mind. Now, I don't know. I've never done my chromosomes. I could be intersexed. I don't know. I personally am a two spirit. I embody both genders. I am masculine and I am feminine, depending on how I feel. And the reason that I state that I am masculine or feminine, depending on how I feel, is because I can feel masculine genitalia when I feel masculine. My body shifts in my feeling. You've heard of things like phantom limbs, things like that. My body shifts in the way that my body feels. This is something that we often call body dysmorphia. So, when we're talking about things such as gender, we have to understand that it is about a concept of this self, right? Gender is about concept of self. It is not about how you conceive me, it is how I conceive myself, right? Because you can't look at me and tell what my body feels like. You can't look at me and tell where I'm in pain. You can't look at me and tell, you know, do I feel off today? Right? You can't look at me and tell what feels okay and what doesn't. And you can't look at me and tell what my brain tells me my body is. And that's the difference between biological sex and gender. Biological sex has to do with biology, and gender has to do with concept of self. It was a little trolly, so I turned them off, but we can go ahead and turn them back on and see. Again, if you're just coming in, we might not have an account very much longer. And so the at Sarah Widda is my backup account. If you would like to go ahead and follow that so that you can have the ability to find me, hi Kenny, then it might be a little bit helpful for you or for me. So as we're looking at gender within society, again, we see that gender within society is a very recent concept. Really early on, we don't see a lot of thought process of gender within society. We do see in some of our earliest writings protections for both sexes, right? We see protections for those that we designate female, and we see protections for those that we designate male. And in sometimes these protections might be different for masculine versus feminine, depending on where you're at or depending on what it is regarding. So if you live in a society where property lines pass down through a patrilineal line, you might find that there are laws in place like Hammurabi's Code that protect women within a patrilineal society so that a woman within a patrilineal society isn't left out in the cold, basically. That does not mean that she has a gender role, and it does not mean that she is subservient to a man. It means that because of the way property lines transfer, they're ensuring the protection of women within the property lines transferred, right? Um, and again, we're talking about a time and a space where women are ruling as often and as much as men are. It is not about whether or not you have a penis or a vagina at this point of time. It is more about whether or not you have the ability to actually function along the lines called for, right? So when we decide that because a woman exists and she has a vagina, that means that she's supposed to give birth and she's supposed to nurture the child in the life that you are leading with this woman. We forget the fact that so many women out there aren't nurturing at all. Let's face it, we've all met women in our life who couldn't nurture a fucking house plant. And so many men in our world are extremely nurturing. They're extremely kind. They're extremely giving, right? So when we look at this idea that all women are supposed to give birth and all women are supposed to nurture, we ignore the facts that women don't always nurture and many women are not nurturing. When we look at an idea that all men are supposed to be strong and they're supposed to be in charge, what we do is put all men in a position where they're dealing with a great deal of depression. If we tell you that you're supposed to be in control of everybody else around you, that's impossible. You're never going to be in control of anybody else around you. Not only is it not healthy for you to be in control of anybody else around you, but the responsibility to be in control of somebody else is an extremely heavy, weighty responsibility that nobody deserves to have put on their shoulders. So when we tell you that you not only must be in control of your woman and must be in control of your child, but you can't talk about your feelings because to talk about your feelings would be to be weak. What we're doing is setting you up for failure. What we're doing is setting you up for pain, right? So just because you have the parts don't mean that you're adequately equipped, and that's very real. So when we divide things like the nurture of our children into what I'm talking about is the cultural concept that men are not supposed to talk and that to be masculine, to be a man means that you're supposed to be stronger than everybody else. You're supposed to be an alpha. You're supposed to be a leader. Don't talk to your friends. Don't show any form of weakness. Never cry. Never show emotion. Nurturing your children is not okay. This is what we are talking like. There's this concept that that is what man means, that unless you embody those things that you're not masculine enough, that you're not a man enough. And none of those things are things that, well, first of all, nobody should have control over another human being unless you are raising a child, and then your level of control should still only be a certain amount, right? Nobody is in control of another human being's life, and you certainly shouldn't be in control of anybody who is of age, right? um and the idea that you're supposed to shoulder all of these burdens and never express feelings behind them is really problematic, right? And it puts men in this space where men aren't able to talk. They're not able to give love. They're not able to, and it's not that they're not feeling these things. It's that they know that if they express these things, people are going to look down upon them. And so they can't express these things. This is why we have a high rate of unaliving in young men, because the fact that young men are put all this pressure, right? All this pressure is put on young men to be this very strong, very dominant, very alpha, go out there and make your money and protect your woman and save this and blah, 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 blah. And in all of that, they don't have an outlet. They don't have the ability to talk or communicate, because if they do, they're considered something faulty. They can't cry when the world hurts, and it hurts us all. Loving their children might be seen as something that's negative. I know many people who were raised to believe that if you show love to your child, then there's something wrong with you. You're not being a man, right? All of these thought processes, all of these things, they're very toxic to men. Rape culture is as toxic to men as it is to women. Why? Because we live in a culture that teaches you that as long as you're a good man, a strong man, who can be in control of everybody else, who never shows his feelings, then you deserve whatever woman you want, which is fallacy. And not only do you deserve whichever woman you want, but you deserve to control that woman in every aspect of her because that's her job to submit to you. This is toxic. It's a fallacy. It creates incels. It creates an entire sect of society that is so manipulated in the way that they think that they can be something that's not even good, and that makes them a good man, and they can therefore have the right to own somebody, to possess somebody, right? So when we're looking at how toxic gender roles form and toxic gender roles shape us, what we're looking at is the idea that your gender dictates your space in society is toxic, that your gender dictates what you're supposed to be doing instead of your talents, instead of the things that sing to you, instead of the things that you're good at, instead of the things that you enjoy. The idea that your gender dictates what you're supposed to do, what you provide for everybody else, instead of who you are dictates what you provide for everybody else. This concept is toxic. That doesn't mean feeling strong is toxic. That doesn't mean feeling nurturing is toxic. That doesn't mean having a child and holding that child and nursing that child is toxic. That doesn't mean being the man who goes out and works so that your wife can stay home with the newborn is toxic. What it means is the idea that your only thing that you provide for society is dictated by your genitalia is toxic. How many men that you know whose only thing that they are worth is a paycheck? How many people do you know in this world whose only thing that they're worth is a paycheck? We have created a society where even men believe their only worth is a paycheck. Toxic to everyone. Toxic gender roles for men are as toxic for men as they are for women. That's why young men are unaliving themselves at a high rate, because they are in a toxic gender role, because they are told that they have to be something that they're not to see any respect or any love, right? So when we are looking at what is toxic within these gender roles, what we're looking at is the idea that your only space within society is your gender. If you have a penis, your only job in this society is to provide a paycheck. If you have a vagina, your only job in this society is to give birth. When we look at our only job within a society as something that might not suit us, might not be who we are, might be completely antithesis to everything that our brain states that we should be, this is toxic. Absolutely, I can answer that. So a lot of times within gender pre-colonization in many spaces, um, we see that there can be, so if it's fluid, like there are places that have specific gender roles and there are places that do not have specific gender roles. Pretty much every indigenous culture that I know of across the globe has more than two genders, right? Usually they have three genders, sometimes they can have five genders. There is an understanding, even within societies that have a gender role pre-colonization, that just because I appear to be that gender doesn't mean I am that gender, right? So there is that fluidity a little bit, right? So if I belong to a society pre-colonization that has gender roles such as women tend and men hunt. Now, this is not usually how it works, right? But let's say that this is what we're going with. So if I live in a society that has the gender roles of women tend and men hunt, and yet it is a society that has three gender roles. I, as somebody who is appearing to be female, might develop as a human being, and my leaning is towards hunting, and my leaning is towards the things that are considered to be more the masculine role. And so I become a member of that third gender, or even become a member of the masculine gender, depending on how that society dictates their gender, the way their genders are, right? So this gives room to work towards what speaks to you instead of working towards fitting into a role that might not speak to you. Does that make sense? So the toxicity comes in the thought process, not that women do this and men do that, but that women only do this and men only do that. And that if you have any shift from this to this, that there's something wrong with you, right? So this is where we start to get to a place where men don't believe that it's okay to express their feelings, because if they express their feelings, they're no longer a strong masculine man, right? This is where we get to a space where if women aren't very nurturing and they would much rather go out and hunt, that they're told that they can't because they have to stay here because that's their role, right? So having masculine and feminine thought processes is not toxic. Feeling masculine or feminine is not toxic. Um, Fitting into things that are traditionally thought of as being more masculine or being more feminine, that is not toxic. What is toxic is you're female, this is your role, you can only do this. You're male, this is your role, you can only do this. And the reason it's toxic is because it forces us to conform to things that might not be who we are. It doesn't allow us to reach the fullest of our potential. It doesn't allow us to become who we are internally, right? Um, so gender roles within themselves, as in um, different things that people do, are not necessarily a Western civilization thing alone. Again, we do see that there are different gender thought processes. Any place where you're seeing, okay, you can have three, four, five genders, right? Obviously has expectations for how that gender sits, right? Yet it allows that mobility of movement if you don't fit into that space, right? The idea that you must fit into the space and conform to a very narrow viewpoint is definitely more of a Western civilization thought process. Yet the idea that different roles are for different people is not, right? Because when you're looking at the idea that gender roles exist outside of that narrow conformity, right? Then you're seeing a space where that gender role is fluid, right? When the gender role becomes narrow, when the gender role means that you can only do, right? Kind of like this very narrow idea of perfection. I mean, we're nothing about us monolithic. So one idea of perfection is pretty screwed up. One idea of who you're supposed to be because you embody this physically is pretty screwed up, right? And it is. It's about, hey, beautiful. It is about the ability to sing to yourself, right? To sing to what sings to you. We live in a world where most people can't understand that I can out hunt and outshoot probably everybody in this chat. I've been trained since I was real little. I shot expert in the military. My godfather named me Little Sure Shot when I was little. I could take pretty much anything and put it in a quarter, full clip, right? Like pretty much anything. I have always been able to outshoot everybody, and I've always been able to track. By the time I was 7, I could literally outshoot all of my father's friends, all of them. We'd come over, they'd do shooting things, I'd outshoot all of them. I've always been able to track. I've always been able to tan. I've always been able to do all of the different things that I needed to do to be able to be self sufficient. So The idea that most people look at somebody with tits and they're like, yeah, she can't hold a gun to save her fucking life, right? That kind of concept is where the problem comes in, without seeing that I okay, you're right. In the military, I didn't put a full clip into anything. You're right. When I'm talking about a full clip, I'm talking about with a 22 or with a 9 mil. Like I'm talking about prior to the military. In the military, when you're shooting expert, it is not a single target. It is multiple targets, and you have to hit each and every single target dead fucking on. You are correct in that. I was talking prior to the military and post military when I'm not working on a military range, right? So, um, when we are looking at what somebody's abilities are, and we decide that somebody's abilities can't be their abilities because of the genitalia they possess, we narrow them down. We take away people who are completely, yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. We take away people's talents. We take away from society people's talents. We take away from society people's abilities to do things, right? And if we have somebody whose talents are cooking, right? If we have somebody who is an amazing chef, who the way that they cook just brings out for everybody, and everybody loves their food because of the joy and the love that they put in it. And we say, well, you're a male, so you can't do that, right? If we have somebody who, oh, children are just their joy. Every time they come around a child, they light up, the children light up. Their interactions with the children are so nurturing, so great. They build people up, right? Gender roles did not build the world that we live in. A, B, the world that you live in is not as nice as you want to think it is. It's actually got a lot of issues to it. So we have somebody who's extremely nurturing. Every time they walk into a room, children just light up and they light up, and the interactions between them and children are so positive, and children grow and they learn because they can teach children in a way that children understand and children don't feel taught down to. But they have a penis, so they can't do that because we're afraid. That's a toxic gender role, right? That limits the community's access to a healthy interaction, right? When we have a woman who is constantly able to do things like hunting, who is really good at things like construction. I did construction half of my life. My mother has done construction most of her life. When we have women who are really good at things like that, but we're like, that's a man's job. You can't do that, right? We take away, like, okay, so to be really good at construction, one of the things that you need to have is the ability to eye a straight line and see a straight line. If I can eye a straight line from across the room and be like on that line, that is something that improves architecture. That is something that improves building. That is something that improves the base construction of the community that I am in. It improves the ability of that community to have good housing, right? So if we take that and we decide, well, you can't do that because you have a vagina and therefore you're supposed to be over here doing this, and we put somebody else in that who has a penis, who is unable to see the plumb line, who is unable to make sure that they're on track, then we have shoddy structures because a man did it, when if we had allowed the woman who had the ability to do it, we would not have the shoddy structures. So when we take a role and decide that because we view you as having this body part, you have to fit into this very narrow viewpoint, we remove the ability for talent. We remove the individual things that each person brings to the table in a community. Every person brings to the table things that sing to them, things that they're really good at. And when you have multiple people with a whole bunch of different talents in a community, that community thrives. But when you have multiple people who only have one talent within a community, that community does not thrive. So when we're looking at gender roles as being something that, if you have this, only able to do this, there's toxicity in it because it blocks for the community the talents that those people have. It blocks for the community the abilities that people have to actually move forward. And it blocks for the people themselves the things that sing to them. This causes depression. This causes, I mean, if you take somebody who has absolutely no nurture and you make them raise a child, that child's going to be abused without even intent. That child is going to be abused. even if they're doing everything they can as a parent, as the role of the nurturer to do their best to nurture, if they don't have the ability to nurture, they won't see the needs. They won't see what needs to be done. And they'll have failure to thrive within the child because the child will not have their needs met, even if they're doing everything they can desperately to try, right? Because they don't have the innate ability to see within that child what is needed or to just give love at times, right? So, because of that, we need to look at the thought process that the idea that your gender role is dictated how somebody else sees you and that you must fit into this very narrow concept is a problematic, is something that is causing problems within society and is causing problems within the world as a whole, right? This is not a debate forum, so I'm not going to invite people up to debate me as that's what you were talking about, which I'm pretty sure it was. Can I sit and have a conversation with people and defend my ideas in a conversation? Absolutely. I do it all the time. But this is not that space and it is not a place for a conversation. Um, and Bond, I don't think that that's very true. And it's slightly anti-Semitic. I don't know if that's the intent, but it's slightly. And while I am free Palestine every day of the week, and Israel itself is a problem, Judaic people are not. And so I would prefer that we're not dealing with any anti-Semitism in my chat, or rather, I prefer that you don't display it so that I have to deal with it, right? um, yeah, because anti-Semitism is not okay. It is not okay to be racist against anybody. It doesn't matter what they're doing. It doesn't matter who they are. It is not okay for racism. It is not, race has been debunked. It doesn't exist. Of course, ethno-religious, which is what Judaism is instead of an actual like thought of as race, is still not okay. We're not dealing with that, right? So when we're looking at the way, I don't think anybody has a problem with the idea of life starting in Africa. And it's not all life that starts, Homo sapiens starts in Africa. Many of the other human species don't start in Africa. Neanderthal, Denisovum, Florensis, Lozonzensis, HLD6, none of these start in Africa. The only ones that start in Africa are Erectus and us, right? And so I don't think that people have a problem with the idea that Homo sapiens starts in Africa. Some people have a problem with the idea that that means that Turtle Island indigenous people are phenotypically Black, because it's not what that is. But nobody that I know really seems to have a problem with the idea that Homo sapiens starts in Africa. And anti-Semitism is not anti-Zionism, and this is very true. Anti-Zionism, well, Zionism is a problem. Being anti-hate is always a good thing. Should all be anti-hate. Thank you for identifying my problems for me. I have a counselor that does that. I actually was just on the phone with her this morning. So she's identified several, and I don't need your help with it. And that's not one of the ones that she identified for me. So when we're looking at having the concept and that because your genitalia exists, you have to conform to a certain role within society. This is the problem. This is the toxicity. Having ideas that women, do certain things, or as a woman feeling like certain things make you feel more feminine and you do them, that's not problematic. What is problematic is having a very narrow thought process of what you're capable or what somebody else is capable of doing based on the gender role that we've defined for them, right? And that's where we get to the toxicity. And that's where I say gender roles are toxic, because the idea that you must fit into a certain role based on your perceived gender by somebody else is the toxicity within it. Now, there are things that are sacredly masculine and things that are sacredly feminine, right? Now, these things can cross over too. It is very sacredly masculine to nurture your child, just like it is very sacredly feminine to nurture your child. Ask the women that are on the front lines in the Ukraine, Ron, how they feel about gender roles. There are many women on the front line in the Ukraine. Because Islam is better than Christianity every day of the week. Islam educates their women. Islam takes care of their people. There are more words of love in the Quran than there are in the Bible, and your lack of education on the subject is showing. And I personally don't think anybody who has been committing a genocide the entire time that they have been in power is a positive, great place at all. And who has rights? Because half of the people in that space don't have rights. So, when we are looking at decolonization, decolonization is one of those things that for many people is problematic in its thought and its concept, right? You want me to explain your God? You mean that God of destruction and hate and genocide, that God of death and war? There's no explanation for your God. He's nasty. I can't explain it. I can't explain why you think that death and genocide is compassion. I can't explain why you think that killing children somehow equates to love. I can't explain how you think that harming others and imposing your ideas on others somehow equates to freedom. I can't equate that. You have to equate it in your own brain because it's not equatable in anything that's logical. I can't equate it for you because it is illogical, right? So when we are looking at decolonization, what we need to understand that first of all, for many people, decolonization is more of a catchword than anything else. We got to understand that, right? When we're looking at decolonization, decolonization is something that for the most of us is something that we can only look at through our own perspective and perform within our mind, right? So if we are in the United States and we are European descendant only, the decolonization that we have to deal with is completely within our brain. There are things that we need to do outside of our brain, but those things aren't here, they're there. So if you are European descendant within the United States and you're working towards decolonization, the first thing that you need to do is start working on decolonizing the thought processes in your brain, right? And then what you need to do is you need to go and find one of the local nations that is working on maintaining sovereignty, getting land rights back. And you speak to that local nation and you offer your services, offer what you have. Now, it's important that when you're going into spaces, you don't go in and you go, hey, I want to do something. What can I do? You go in and you say, hey, I've got these skills. What do you need? It's also important that you do not go into a space and you go, hey, I think this is what you need to do. So we're going to do that because that's not helping anybody. Local resident, that's unfactual. And I would appreciate it if you didn't use caps. Okay. So when we're looking at decolonization outside of being a member of the occupying or colonizing people within a space, and we are the colonized people within a space, decolonization takes on a whole different meaning. Decolonization and things like that has to do with first returning your thought process to thought processes prior to colonization, and second, working towards the ability to maintain space, maintain tending and governance, maintain belonging, right? So when we are looking at decolonization, it is going to be something completely different for somebody in a completely different setting, right? It should be understood, though, that if you, again, are of European descent or if you are the colonizing group within a space, that you decolonize by decolonizing the way you think and then helping the local colonized space decolonize. If you're in Sweden, it might mean helping the Sami, right, to decolonize. If you're in Japan, it might mean helping the Innu to decolonize. If you're in Australia, it might be helping the indigenous Australians to decolonize, right? Yet first you must work within your mind to figure out what thought processes that you're dealing with that are colonial thought processes and concepts. Race is a colonial thought process and concept, right? So once you work through in your mind, or once you start working through in your mind, what is the colonial thought processes that you're working with, it's important to then take the knowledge that you have and take the skills that you have into a space and offer the skills, not the knowledge. Nobody needs that at that point, right? But the skills that you have to help that decolonization. Many people look at things like land back and think that that means that somebody's trying to kick people out. The only people telling everybody to go back to where they came from are the European immigrants. That's it. Nobody else is sitting here going back where you came from unless you're from Europe and it's not where you came from anyways. When people are talking concepts of land back across the globe, in every space of people that I have talked to, land back does not mean get the fuck out. What it means is the returning of tending and governance to Indigenous people. It means that not having the United States government in play, but instead having the government of nations in play, right? It means returning the care of the space and the concepts to the indigenous people of that area. It does not mean get the fuck out, right? Now, myself, I'm indigenous to Turtle Island, right? So there's never any space that I'm going to be, it's not going to be a kick out, anyways. But even if I wasn't, even if this white looking ass steps into a space, right? I'm not going to be kicked out when land back comes. It's not about go back to where you came from. It's about let me take care of my space. For many indigenous groups across the globe, space isn't a place that you own, it's a place that you belong to. Let me repeat that because that concept is hard for many people to handle. Land is not a place that you own, it's a place that you belong to. Space is not a place that you own, it's a place that you belong to, right? So, for many people across the globe, it is about having the space that they were supposed to tend, that they were supposed to take care of because they belong to that space where they can tend it, where they can nurture it, where they can return to the concepts of land tending and governance that are indigenous, that have provided the health and the benefit in that space. It is not about making people go back where they came from. And so many people have this fear that that's what it means. That's not it. And that's one thing that I want people to understand, because for most people, when they hear concepts like land back, they get scared. And let's face it, that's what it is. It's fear, right? And when we get scared and we're dealing with this fear, that fear stops us from doing things. Courage is being afraid and doing it anyways. Yet for many people, they don't have the courage to walk through that fear and do it anyways. They're just living that fear. I know where I belong to. I'm from the Pacific Northwest. My community is within the Pacific Northwest. That's where I belong. That is where I belong to. That is the land that I have nurtured since I could walk. Okay. So I know where I belong to. And we should all know where we belong to. We should all know what part of the earth we belong to. We should all know what part of the earth sings to our soul, because that's what it is. It is what part of the earth sings to our soul, right? People in Turtle Island, which is North America, if you're unaware, and people in Abya, which is South America, if you're unaware, have been here for over 50,000 years. Let me repeat that. People in Turtle Island, which is North America, if you are unaware, and people in Abya, which is South America, if you are unaware, have been here for 50,000 years. The oldest Homo sapiens in Britain are 14,000 years old, and we found them last year. The oldest Homo sapiens in Scandinavia are 7,000 years old. The oldest people in Europe, the southern part of Europe, are 50,000 years old. So, people in Turtle Island and people in Abiyala, having been here for 50,000 years, and actually it's 54,000 years is what the DNA states, okay? Having been here for at least 50,000 years, have been here longer than people have been in Northern Europe or Northern Asia. It is understood that there was a southern boat route across the South Pacific that brought people to Turtle Island and Abiyala. And it is understood that people in Turtle Island and Abiyala have had a civilization here longer than most parts across the globe. The only places outside of Africa that have had civilization as long as Turtle Island are in Australia. Indigenous Australians have been there 70,000 years. So the oldest civilizations across the globe are indigenous people. So when we are looking at this concept that everybody's indigenous to somewhere, which is true, everybody has a space on this planet that their ancestors are from and that their ancestors were indigenous to. And when we look at the concept of, well, you came here anyways, we need to understand that people have been in Turtle Island and Abiyala longer than people have been in England, longer than people have been in France, longer than people have been in Germany, longer than people have been in Scandinavia. There have been Homo sapiens in this space. Everybody's argument has a point. That's the whole point, isn't it? So when we talk about decolonization, what we talk about is not the removal of people, but what we talk about is the removal of ideas, the return to indigenous concepts and then return to indigenous ideas, and the returning of governance and tending to indigenous people across the globe. This is the land back concept as well. And the reason that I bring this into this space is because I know that there are many people who do not understand. And it is okay that you do not understand because nobody told you. And so I'm here to tell you. Indigenous people are not settlers. Let's go over a couple of concepts of vocabulary. Immigration, migration, colonization. These are three different ways that people move into an area. Migration is a pattern, or it is moving into a space that is not occupied. So you can either have a migratory pattern. You have maybe a 10-mile space that you migrate throughout the year. Here's where your berries are. Here's where the best hunting is. Here's where the salmon run is. And you migrate throughout the year. Okay, so that's a migration pattern. We see this within hunter-gatherers. That is what hunter-gathering is. So there are two different kinds of people living pre-concept. Hunter-gatherer and collector, they're both the same peoples. They just do two different ways of collecting their things. Collector cultures have their center space here and they leave their center space, camp here, grab stuff, come back. Hunter-gatherers migrate. Okay. So migration either is a migration pattern within your subsistence, your living, or it is migrating to a new area. And there are no people in that area, right? Immigration is moving into an area that there are people present in. They go into an area, there's already a community there, there's already a group there, and you become a part of the community and you become a part of the group. You listen to the elders of that community, you listen to the leaders of that community, you form a membership with that community, you are a part of that community, right? That is immigration. Colonization is going into an area and deciding that the community already in that area doesn't get a choice anymore, and you're going to replace it with your governance and your tending. You don't fit in, you don't belong to, you don't become a part of, you overthrow, you overrule, oftentimes through violence. In fact, I can't think of a sense or any colonization that's ever happened that did not have violence attributed to it. And when you read about colonization, it will tell you that it is usually with violence. So, colonization, immigration, and migration are three different things. When people immigrated to the United States, or not to the United States, to Abiyala and to Turtle Island, this would absolutely be an immigration. And the reason that this is an immigration is because, again, there are other species across the planet that speciated outside of Africa. And one of those species speciated here in Turtle Island and Abiyala. This is a ghost species that we see with an indigenous DNA in Turtle Island and Abiyala 250,000 years ago. There are finds that are 250,000 years old in Turtle Island. The 250,000-year-old finds in Turtle Island are finds of artwork and bone tools and stone tools. And these finds show a civilization that was here, which is a descendant civilization of Homo erectus, just like Neanderthal, Denisovan, and Sapien are all descendant civilizations of Homo erectus, right? So whatever descendant civilization that was here gets enveloped into the people that come over when Homo sapiens come over. So this is a immigration where they become enveloped within the culture. And their DNA is the same DNA as this civilization. That's a ghost species within them. So for Turtle Island Indigenous people and Abiyalian Indigenous people, and the same is true of Indigenous Australians, because there is evidence of civilizations prior to Indigenous Australians arriving, prior to Homo sapiens arriving in Australia as well. This is speciating in a place. So if you are Turtle Island Indigenous or Abiyalian Indigenous, you speciated in this space, not as Homo sapien, but as the ancestor species that mixed with Homo sapien when Homo sapien got here. So you are absolutely not only the original Homo sapiens in this space, but you have the DNA of the people that speciated in this space. So immigration and migration as Homo sapiens absolutely happens. And yet the speciation, the multi-regional speciation that many people talk about, the speciation within this space also happened for your ancestors. And that becomes a part of you. So Homo sapiens, well, we speciated in Africa in several different spaces across the globe. We have species within us that speciated in other spaces, just like we have Denisovan in us. And Denisovan speciates in Asia. And when Denisovan speciates in Asia, they get different adaptations to that space. And so when people move in and interbreed and intermix with Denisovans, they get those alleles, those genomes, those chromosomes that give them different advantages, like a low oxygen advantage so that you can live on the top of mountains, right? So we are looking at indigeneity. We are looking at people who not only as Homo sapiens came to a space well before people got anywhere else, we are also looking at a people who have DNA within them of the species that speciates in this space, and therefore you can't get more indigenous. That's as indigenous as it gets, right? And it is called evolution. It's called evolution. It's called evolving in a space, right? So when we're looking at decolonization, we have to understand that, again, decolonization does not mean get out. It means returning of tending and governance to indigenous groups across the globe. It's the same thing as land back. It is about returning the tending and governance to the people whose space they belong to, right? And when we're looking at this, we need to understand the indoctrination that so many of us live under, because the indoctrination that so many of us live under is causing the problems that we're all dealing with. We're all indoctrinated into a concept that there's a higher power. We're all indoctrinated into a concept that gender roles exist and they're firm, that your biological sex determines what you're supposed to do in this world. We're all indoctrinated into a concept that your worth is based on what you can be exploited for, right? Nigel, nobody got conquered, honey. You didn't win. You think you won, but you didn't win. If you weigh more than me, you can push me down and you can lay on top of me and you can hold me there. If you weigh more than me, that doesn't mean you won. It means that you overpowered me for a minute, but you best watch your back when I get up. You can overpower somebody and maintain control over somebody for a hot second. But if history has proven anything, it is that you cannot do it for a long period of time. Hitler won. Hitler won a lot. We see where that got him. You didn't win. You didn't conquer anything. And really, 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 where would we be without colonization? Healthier, happier, not killing ourselves as a species. Colonization is why we've caused climate destruction. Why our species is going extinct is colonization. Colonization is a negative impact on this planet and on the people, and has been a negative impact on this planet and on its people from day one. We would not be polluting our planet to our own self extinction without colonization. No, it's not an argument for ethnic cleansing because on no way and in no shape am I calling for even the removal of people. Again, land back and decolonization do not mean people go back where they came from. That's a European concept. Go back where you came from. That's something European state, right? Again, it is not about removing people. It is not about ending people on any level. Ending colonization doesn't end any group of people. It stops ongoing genocide. There's ongoing genocide in the United States and Canada. There's ongoing genocide here. It has been ongoing since 1492. So you stop the ongoing genocide. That's not ethnic cleansing, that's ending ethnic cleansing. Hitler got his concepts from the United States. South Africa got their concepts from the United States. South Africa and Hitler specifically came here to learn the racism here because we have the best racism. That's one of the things we're number one in. The United States is number one in racism, maternal mortality rate for the industrialized world, and mass incarcerations. That's what we're number one in. So we're not talking. You're right. Hitler never set foot in the United States. He went to the people within the United States, the government within the United States, and got his concepts from the government within the United States. God, semantics. So, and South Africa will tell you that they came here for their colonization or for their racism. So, I mean, nice try, but you need to get some history. I live in a racist country. I don't have to go anywhere to see it. Live in a racist country. No ethnic group commits more crimes. As a European, how do I stop colonization? I was just kind of born into it. It's a really good question. So really what it is first you have to work to decolonize the thought process, right? You have to work to look at what you've been indoctrinated into. Look at the concepts that are colonial concepts. Now, that's not easy for anybody. And way to start is to look at, you can go through and look at what indigenous, you have to make sure that you're looking at actual indigenous people who are authors or indigenous people who are content creators or things like that. But look at indigenous concepts in different spaces across the globe. Go to the Sami, go to the Ainu, go to the many different indigenous groups in Africa, like the Amazigh. And when you're looking at these different indigenous groups, it's not to take their concepts and use them, it's to see the difference. it's to see the difference. I'm not white, I'm indigenous. I just am white appearing. So it is to see the different concepts. It's not to take them, it's not to appropriate them, but it's to see, okay, well, that makes sense. So that means that this doesn't make sense. So I have to rethink the way this thinks. And it is really just so that you can see the difference between colonized thought process and decolonized thought process or pre-colonized thought process. And the next thing that you really have to do is once you can start identifying those things that are indoctrinated, once you can start identifying those things that are colonization, you'll actually start identifying more and more and more on your own, right? And once you can start identifying those things, I don't owe you anything, does not a damn thing. So, and if you are indigenous, that you know asking for somebody's roll card is extremely an inappropriate thing to do in a public space. That's doxing yourself, and I would never do that. So just telling you. Um, so when we are looking at concept is the first thing that you have to do. You have to get rid of the indoctrination within your brain, right? Once you can start getting rid of the indoctrination, you'll start to see it roll through. You'll see it just come through. You can also study a lot of Western history and Western thought process, because once you're studying the Western history and the Western thought process, you can see which things come from that Western concept. So say you're looking at the way that Egypt was colonized, right? And in looking at the way that Egypt is colonized, this is something that's pretty well documented, right? You can see, okay, so these thought processes were brought in. This is a colonial thought process. The other thing is the understanding that things that justify atrocity are often colonial concepts. Race as a theory is a colonial concept. Race does not exist. It's been debunked by the field, my field that created it. It is not correct. It doesn't work. Like, it's genetically incorrect. Your phenotype does not dictate your genotype. So you start looking at what the colonial concepts are. Once you are working in your brain with those things, which is a lifelong work. It's not something that any of us can do overnight. Once you start looking into these things, and once you start making those movement forward within your brain, it becomes time to help the people around you decolonize. So if you were European, this might, or European descendant here in the United States, this might be talking to people and trying to help them decolonize, talking to other Europeans and trying to help them decolonize. It might mean going to your local nation and seeing what you can do to help that local nation decolonize. Again, I want to always state that when you're going to a local nation, you should not go in there with the concept that you know what to do, right? You should not go in there with ideas of what you're going to do for them. You go in there and you go, okay, so I have these talents. I'm really good at carpentry. Is there anything I can do to help? I'm really good at oration. Is there anything I can do to help? I'm really good at research. Is there anything I can do to help? Right? It's about uplifting and helping others at that point. So you have to change your perspective, and then you have to change your actions, right? And as a European within the United States, the only way to decolonize is within the thought process, and then to help others to decolonize. You can't decolonize as an action of yourself within the United States as a European descendant, right? Because you're either helping colonize or you're helping decolonize. There's no middle ground. So at that point, you're helping decolonize, right? Yet until the point that you're helping decolonize and helping others decolonize, you're still a part of the colonization, right? So we have to see this as, oh shit, that's what I need. Hold on one second. I hadn't taken my meds this morning. How do I propose to decolonize the Nords? First of all, you're thinking Scandinavia. And I would say by listening to the Sami. There are indigenous people in Scandinavia. They're called the Sami, and they could really use some help, right? They faced residential schools. Um, they have faced genocide, and they could really use, people listening to them. There are creators on here who are actively fighting in Scandinavia for land back and their decolonization of Scandinavia. Sociopaths don't mind, they don't care. That's one of those ways that you can tell whether or not you're a decent human being or a sociopath if you give a shit. Like if you give a shit about what's going on around you, you're okay. You're having a healthy response to an unhealthy situation. If you don't give a shit, you need some counseling because you might be a sociopath. How do we know that the Sami are indigenous to that area? Well, first of all, because the Sami have maintained their indigenous connection. Second of all, through DNA. The UN defines indigenous and native as two different things. It is only here within the United States that we define indigenous and native as the same thing. The UN defines indigenous as a community that has maintained their culture, as well as there's a whole list of what's indigenous by the UN. What is native by the UN is a group that might have been there as long as the indigenous community, but they're the group that's the governing group. So in Sweden, the Sami are the indigenous group, and the Swedish government is the native group, right? And so genetically and archaeologically, we know that two groups of people arrive in Scandinavia at the same time frame. One group comes from south of Eurasia or Europe, and that group is dark of skin and light of eye. And one group comes from the European steppes, the Eurasian steppes, and that group is dark of eye and light of skin. That is a Finno-Ugric speaking language group, and that is the Sami. And the group coming from the southern part of Europe is a Indo-European speaking language group, and that is the Swedish in Sweden. Same thing in Norway. It would be the Sami versus the Norwegian, and not versus, but the Sami and the Norwegians there. I know the Sami are in another country, but I can't remember the other country's name off the top of my head. I know that the Sami are in 3 current political countries, and I don't remember what the third one is off the top of my head. So who do you mean by the Nordics? Do you mean by the Norwegians? Most people say Nordic and they mean the entire of Scandinavia, and that's why I'm asking. Nordic, including Britain and Iceland, part of Russia. Britain's not considered a Nordic country. Britain's indigenous people on the island of Britain, the indigenous people would be the Scots and the Kurnow. I probably mispronounced that, but I have somebody in here who will correct it. And the Cymry, and those are the indigenous groups within the island of Britain. In Ireland, it's the Irish Gaelic, right? That are the indigenous groups there. Iceland, it would actually be the Icelandic people. They're the first people in Iceland. So the indigenous people of Iceland would absolutely be the Icelandic people. There were not another people there at the time, right? So the indigenous people in Iceland would be the Icelanders. And I've described who's the indigenous people in Britain. That's Scandinavia, HJ. With the exception of Russia, that's Scandinavia. And I know many Sami, and Sami are absolutely fighting for land back within the regions that Sami people are within. So, decolonization and land back again do not mean people are being kicked out. What they mean is returning of tending and governance to the indigenous people of a space. No. Scandinavia is Sweden, Finland, Greenland, Norway, Iceland, the Åland Islands, Denmark, and the Faroe Islands. Britain is an entirely different thing. Britain doesn't fall under Nord at all. Britain isn't even Nordic people. Britain was the Angles and the Saxons and the Celts. Like the Celts were there, and then the Angles and the Saxons colonized, which are Germanic in descent people, which are the same Germanic in descent people of many other regions of Scandinavia, right? Because they all start out as Germanic tribes, right? Yet Britain is not a Nordic country or a Scandinavian country, right? Um, and again, Scandinavian countries are Sweden, Finland, Greenland, Norway, Iceland, the Åland Islands, Denmark, and the Faroe Islands. That's Scandinavia. So, when we are looking at decolonization and land back, it is important to understand that that does not mean that people are getting kicked out. What it means is returning and tending of governance. It is not Iroquois goddess, actually. Actually, like the Ainu in Japan are lighter skinned than the Japanese, and they actually look more European, as in like they have more European facial features, and they're lighter skinned than the Japanese, and that's the indigenous group within Japan. The Amazi people of North Africa are light skinned, and they are an indigenous group in North Africa. The Sami are light of skinned, and they started out lighter skinned than the other Scandinavian groups, because the other Scandinavian groups were darker while they were lighter. They actually haven't gotten lighter while the other groups have gotten lighter. So in the United States, some. So because of the way that our skin tone is dependent on our place along the equator, there are different indigenous groups within the United States and Canada that are actually lighter of skin prior to colonization. Many of the peoples in the Arctic regions are lighter of skin. Now that doesn't mean that everybody's like light white. What it means is that in the scale, they are lighter in the shading. There are some people that are members of nations that are actually pretty light, who are fully indigenous, like do not have a lot of European ancestry within them, right? And so it really just has to do with where they are on the equatorial region, right? And that is absolutely there. Even those who are lighter of skin here in Turtle Island and Abiyala have that undertone. So we all have an undertone here in Turtle Island and Abiyala, just like most of Asia has an undertone, and Australia has an undertone. The undertones don't mean that we don't have a range of skin color over it, though. Like, so in Asia, your undertone is a little bit more of a kind of a golden or a yellow, right? But you can get extremely light in the northern part of Asia and extremely dark in the southern part of Asia. Here in Turtle Island and Abiyala, you can get extremely light up in the Nordic regions, and you can northern regions, and you can get extremely dark along the equatorial regions. This extremely dark still has a copper undertone. It is not phenotypically black. And this extremely light has a copper undertone. It's not phenotypically European, right? And so you can see that that copper undertone is really there everywhere. The overtone changes, the shading of that copper undertone changes, basically. Where do I get my info about the difference on Scandinavian Nordics? So, as an archaeologist and an anthropologist, the first grave that I've studied, the grave that I'm writing a book on, like everything that I focus on is Scandinavian. Like is BJ 581 is a grave in in Burka in Lake Malmo in Sweden, right? I did Google what countries to make sure that I had my knowledge correct before I restated it. So I did Google what countries are considered Scandinavia to make sure that I have my knowledge on spot. And I will do that frequently. Anybody who's in here will tell you I do that frequently, because no, Malmo is a lake. There might be a town named Malmo as well, but Lake Malmo is in Sweden, not Stockholm. What is it that's on the end at the edge of it? But it is a lake, like an inland sea, basically. And Bjorko or Burka was the is the kind of like Anglicization of it. Um, so yeah, it goes through. It's a lake that goes through. It's an inland sea. If you look at the map, um, I'd have to pull up a map. So let me go ahead and pull up a map. No, it doesn't go over. So Bjorka is the original, like it's the oldest um, global center of a city that they have found so far within that area, and it is Stockholm. That's right on the edge of it. So it's like an inland sea, and the island of Burka or Bjorko is in there. It doesn't actually, though, go all the way over into Norway. It's probably a different space within Norway and this similar name, different space. Cool, man. Your kids are indigenous, even if they're half white, right? Like, so they're indigenous, unless it's half white and something else. And then what we're getting to is the fact that unless you're a member of the indigenous group in an area, your decolonization outside of self is to help others to decolonize. Does that make sense? Okay, yeah. So at that point, they're indigenous. They're not white. Even if they are half white, they're indigenous, right? Indigeneity, we're often told that there's different groups, and some groups are like, well, you're half this and you're half that, and so you're not this. But most groups will tell you that if you are indigenous, you're indigenous. You don't break it up into different sections. Now, you can, like, I call myself globally mixed, right? I'm globally mixed indigenous. You can call yourself Afro indigenous. You can call yourself however you want to frame it in your brain to identify yourself. Yet, you're indigenous. You're just indigenous, right? Um, Yeah, and many of us are told otherwise. Yet most elders will tell you that if you're indigenous, you're indigenous. Don't qualify it, you're indigenous, right? But if you have, and most elders will tell you if you have a drop of indigenous blood, you are indigenous, is what most elders will tell you, right? So when we are looking at the way that we're dealing with indoctrination, that's actually another one of those things within the indoctrinated thought process, right? So most people think that, you have to have a label to be, this and this and this, instead of understanding that indigenous is indigenous is indigenous is indigenous, right? Um, that's a part of that indoctrinated thought process. When we look at things like blood quantum, that's another thought of that indoctrinated thought process. Most indigenous groups never really gave a shit about your blood. They gave a shit about who you were across the globe, right? So when we're looking at trying to dismantle the indoctrinated thought process, that's another one of those things that we can see. Like, again, once you start, the things start to fall. Once you look at one or two things, you see it in everything. You start to see it. We've all, like when you buy a new car and now that new car is everywhere, right? So when we're looking at starting to decolonize your mind, starting to de-indoctrinate yourself, once you start, it starts to fall. It's just there, it's just there, it's just there, right? The ideology of race needs to be dismantled as well, absolutely. As we've started to dismantle race theory and started to debunk race theory and started to change the understanding that race theory exists, right? As we've started to do that, unfortunately, of course, racism is still such a prevalent and invasive part of all of society that it is one of those things that has to be dismantled as well. And the other things that have to be dismantled are really going through you know, our idea that your race means that your phenotype means your genotype, that what I perceive you to be is who you are instead of your life experiences is who you are, instead of your personal identity is who you are. So, so Highland, that's true throughout history, but history is not us. History only goes back like 6,000 years. History is written word. We're 300,000 years as a species. Prior to 10,000 years ago, there's no violence. Prior to 10,000 years ago, we have 2,000 remains, 2,000 humans that we have prior to 10,000 years ago. And of those 2,000 humans, 2% have things that could possibly be attributed to violence. And I'm going to clarify what I mean by could possibly be attributed to violence. If I see somebody that looks like a rock caved their head in, I don't know if somebody was wielding that rock and smashing their head or if a rock fell from somewhere and hit their head. So it could be attributed to violence, but I can't tell you whether or not it was violent. I could tell you that it could be, but I can't tell you that it is. So prior to 10,000 years, 2% have things that can possibly be attributed to violence. At 10,000 years, we get definitive violence enter into the archaeological record. And the things that could be attributed to violence or are definitive violence jumps to 18 to 20%, right? Through archaeology. This is archaeology. That's what I'm stating is archaeological stuff, right? And so we see that at 10,000 years, we see this jump in anything that could be attributed to violence, as well as things that are absolutely violence. Can't put them any other way. One of the first things is a massacre in Kenya where 8 people are set in a row, and one of them is a pregnant woman sitting cross-legged on the ground with her hands tied up underneath her belly, and she's hit from behind with, I think it's a spear, like she's killed from behind with a spear. So it's definitely a killing. So, and that's like one of our earliest things that can actually be attributed to definitive violence. Prior to that, we don't have definitive violence in the archaeological record. Prior to that, we do not see definitive violence within Homo sapien. We do not see it within any of the other species. Because of this, we can see that along the same timeline at 10,000 years ago, we get to the point where we get ownership of land. And when we get to the point where we get ownership of land, we also start to see cities based on agriculture, and we start to see hierarchies forming. And these hierarchies forming are based on ownership of land and ownership of people. And once you start forming hierarchies based on ownership of land and yes, but that's not us. And I don't study chimps. That's not who I do. Uh, but I do know that some of the violence that they see within chimps and stuff like that isn't necessarily violence. It's actions of defense or actions of species continuity, which is not violence. And I am talking specifically about human. I'm not talking about other animals, right? Um, because I don't study other animals. That's not what I do. I study human evolution. So when we see this rise of violence in the archaeological record at the same time that we see, no, do you study everything in the planet? Tell me how to dismantle an M16. Tell me how to set a straight line in a house. Tell me how to drive a nail home. Tell me what the original primate is and tell me what the original mammal is. Tell me who comes first, mammals or lizards, and tell me whether or not you can find salt in a lake across the globe. You don't know everything. You shouldn't know everything. You shouldn't attempt to know everything. It's a little fucking brain that we have. Fitting everything in it is stupid. Because once you start pushing everything into that little fucking brain you have, shit starts pushing itself out. You cannot maintain a constant influx of knowledge without forgetting things. I am not here to teach you about primates. I am not here to talk to you about animals. I'm here to talk to you about humans. So that's not cherry picking to not be able to tell you what chimpanzees do when I'm telling you what Homo sapien does. It's having a focal area and not worrying about things that other people get to worry about. If you want information on what chimpanzees do, I encourage you to find somebody who understands and studies chimpanzees, because I'm not it. So when we look at the rise of violence at 10,000 years ago, not white, indigenous, when we look at the rise of violence at 10,000 years ago, that rise of violence at 10,000 years ago is associated with hierarchy, and it's associated with ownership of land and ownership of people. This all comes down to this thought process that I should maintain control over you. This is where we get into that indoctrinated, colonized thought process starting, right? So when we're looking at this, we can see in the early God Kings, once we get to the point of writing, that these early God Kings are all documented as having very traumatic childhoods, and their behavior seems to fit the narcissistic personality disorder profile. So these early God Kings use the process within their brain and the trauma that they have been through to create their need to hoard. So a lot of times, and we see this, we've probably all heard of how people who lived through the Great Depression have a tendency to hoard food. Most people who live through a great dearth have a tendency to hoard whatever they didn't have. People who never had shoes as a children have a tendency to buy a lot of shoes. People who starve have a tendency to make sure that they have food. I grew up knowing people that had like 5 or 6 different fucking freezers full of food because they lived through the Great Depression, right? I'm not, a, that's not anachronistic. Uh, we changed everybody's thought once. Can't we change everybody's thought again? In fact, we've changed it many, many, many times. Can't we change it again? Right? The only thing that is given for humanity is death and change. The only thing that is given for you is death and change. It's not death and taxes. Taxes aren't always there. It's death and change. We are constantly changing, constantly growing, right? And we all die. Yeah, we can change it without more violence. That's where we get to decolonization and de-indoctrination, right? That's where we change our concept of thought. If we can change our concept of thought, then we can change everything without violence, right? So, again, we see the rise of narcissistic God Kings, as I tend to call them, at when we see the start of writing. And what we see within all of these is a couple of concepts. We see this concept of hoarding, and we see this concept of how they maintain hoarding by using the othering that we still use today. What causes to be a culture of violence? It's absolutely ownership. It's absolutely believing that you can own things and the need to hoard things. So once you start believing that you can own the land, you start believing that you can own human. And once you start believing that you can own the land and that you can own human, you have to maintain your power. So to maintain your power, you have to harm other people. So for the early kings to maintain power, we get the start of othering. Othering is a concept that instead of you seeing that I'm the problem, you see that your neighbors are the problem, right? So instead of you seeing that Sargon, the first documented king that we have, is the problem, what you see is that the barbarians in the hills are the problem. So you have to pay Sargon your grain so that Sargon can pay his army your grain so that you can be protected from the barbarians in the hills taking your grain, right? So when we see this concept of othering starting, this concept of othering as it starts gives this rise to violence. This othering, this ability to dehumanize other human beings based on what we can decide that they are, really leads down to the ability for those in charge to hoard, those in charge to maintain their space on the top of the hierarchy. We see it start with the barbarians in the hills, and then when everybody is in different cities, we see it become that other city is doing things wrong and they want your stuff. And when we see it translate down from there next, we see it translate into gender. We see it translate into gender within the ancient Greeks, who decide that women are less than men, mainly because they were pedophilic and they preferred young boys to women. After the Greeks, we see it translate down into religion. And this starts when we see monotheism start, and then it becomes my religion is better than yours. God gave me this land so I can genocide people on this land. And then we see it translate into race. And of course, the concept of race starts as a biblical concept and then translates into a scientific concept when science really takes off. And as it takes into a scientific construct, it is definitely the need of European men to justify the atrocities that they're already committing. And so we see the development of the theory of race as a scientific concept. All of these are methods of othering. Currently, our methods of othering not only are all of these, but include as well immigration and houselessness. Uh, if you are afraid of the immigrant, then you are not afraid of the government stealing your money. If you are more terrified of the person who's actually their families lived in this area for 50,000 years than you are of your government, then you will let your government steal from you. Crippler, you are incorrect. There are indigenous groups in Turtle Island that absolutely did things, correct? Right? We do know of the Aztec versus the Maya, right? That would be colonization, and that would be a massacre. For the most part, most indigenous groups in Turtle Island and Aviala did not do things like that, though. For the most part, any concept of fighting was not done in a death manner. We've all heard things like counting coup. That's a pretty common knowledge, right? And for the most part, people are living more in trading thought processes than they do are in murdering thought processes. And most things like raiding and stuff like that is not done to create harm, but done to broaden the genome, right? Like, so if you belong to, say, a patrilineal culture, all the women in your nation are your siblings or your cousins. So to get a woman outside your nation, you might go on something that might be perceived by somebody else as a raid, but which is really going in and getting your wife, who you've already planned, who you've already seen, who you already know, and bringing her back without killing her siblings, right? So a lot of the concepts that we have translated into European concepts were not done in the way that European concepts have translated them into, right? And this is pretty common knowledge among indigenous communities and pretty common knowledge within archaeology and anthropology as well. So that's not true. That's not true. That's actually like completely absence of fact, with the exception of the only one that we know that did that, which was the Aztecs. And DNA shows that the Aztecs and the Maya are pretty much the same people. Like their genetics are pretty much the same people. So you got cousins fighting over grandpa's land. My sources are all on my website, widdaord.com. And you're more than welcome to go there. So where we do have places like with the Aztecs and Maya, where we have cousins fighting over land, the concept that all these nations were warring with each other is completely infactual and not documented by the Europeans either. Why do you think we call them the 5 civilized tribes? The 5 civilized tribes cover pretty much all of the southern half of the east coast of the United States. And they didn't go to war with each other. They all lived in peace and harmony. And we're talking millions of fucking people. Turtle Island is one of the indigenous phrases used for North America, obviously translated into English. It's for many different reasons. The Anishinaabe have a story of Sky Woman falling. And it's a beautiful story. Actually, this is one of my favorites. Oh, 1 second. This is only one nation's story. It is not why other nations call this Turtle Island, though there are similar stories sometimes, though not all of them. This is Braiding Sweetgrass. It's a book by Robin Wall Kimmerer. If you have not read it, I recommend it. It is one of the best books out there. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a mother, scientist, decorated professor, and enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Her first book, Gathering Moss, was awarded the John Burroughs Medal for Outstanding Nature Writing. Her writings have appeared in Orion, O Magazine, and numerous scientific journals. She lives in Fabius, New York, where she is a SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor of Environmental Biology and the founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment. Sky Woman Falling. She fell like a maple seed, pirouetting on an autumn breeze, a column of light streaming from a hole in the sky world, marking her path where only darkness had been before. It took her a long time to fall. In fear or maybe hope, she clutched a bundle tightly in her hand. Hurtling downward, she saw only dark water below, but in that emptiness there were many eyes gazing up at the sudden shaft of light. They saw there a small object, a mere dust mote in the beam. As they grew closer, they could see that it was a woman, arms outstretched, long black hair billowing behind as she spiraled towards them. The geese nodded at one another and rose together from the water in a wave of goose music. She felt the beat of their wings as they flew beneath to break her fall. Far from the only home she had ever known, she caught her breath at the warm embrace of soft feathers as they gently carried her downward, and so it began. The geese could not hold the woman above the water for much longer, so they called a council to decide what to do. Resting on their wings, she saw them all gather: loons, otters, swans, beavers, fish of all kinds. A great turtle floated in their midst and offered his back for her to rest upon. Gratefully, she stepped from the goose wings onto the dome of his shell. The others understood that she needed land for her home and discussed how they might serve her need. The deep divers among them had heard of mud at the bottom of the water and agreed to go find some. Loon drove first, but the distance was too far, and after a long while he surfaced with nothing to show for his efforts. One by one, the other animals offered to help: otter, beaver, sturgeon. But the depth, the darkness, the pressures were too great for even the strongest swimmers. They returned gasping for air with their heads ringing. Some did not return at all. Soon only little Muskrat was left, the weakest diver of all. He volunteered to go while the others looked on doubtfully. His small legs flailed as he worked his way downward, and he was gone a very long time. They waited and waited for him to return, fearing the worst for their relative, and before long a stream of bubbles rose with the small, limp body of Muskrat. He had given his life to aid this helpless human. But then the others noticed that his paw was tightly clenched, and when they opened it, there was a small handful of mud. Turtle said, "Here, put it on my back, and I will hold it." Sky Woman bent and spread the mud with her hands across the shell of the turtle. Moved by the extraordinary gifts of the animal, she sang in thanksgiving and began to dance, her feet caressing the earth. The land grew and grew as she danced her thanks from the dab of mud on Turtle's back until the whole earth was made, not by Sky Woman alone, but from the alchemy of all the animal's gifts, coupled with her deep gratitude. Together they formed what we know of today as Turtle Island, our home. Like any good guest, Sky Woman had not come empty-handed. The bundle was still clenched in her hand. When she toppled from the home in Sky World, she had reached out to grab onto the tree of life that grew there. In her grasp were branches, fruits, and seeds of all kinds of plants. These she scattered onto the new ground and carefully tended each one until the world turned from brown to green. Sunlight streamed through the hole from the sky world, allowing the seeds to flourish. Wild grasses, flowers, trees, and medicines spread everywhere. And now that the animals too have plenty to eat, many came to live with her on Turtle Island. This is one of the creation myths of one of the eastern nations in Turtle Island, Citizen Potawatomi. So there's a lot more to this. It's beautiful, and I'll go ahead and read some of the rest of it. But this is one of the reasons, or one of the nations that uses the phrase Turtle Island. And so Turtle Island is a phrase that has been adopted by many people in North America to use as an indigenous term for this area. Abayala is one of the names used for South America, and it's been adopted by many people to use for South America. We see that there's about 5 or 6 different terms used for North America and 5 or 6 different terms used for South America. I use these two because they're the ones that I know and the ones that I've been taught. Our stories say that of all the plants, Wingashk, or sweetgrass, was the very first to grow on the earth. Its fragrance, a sweet memory of Sky Woman's hand. Accordingly, it is honored as one of the 4 sacred plants of my people. Breathe in its scent and you start to remember things you didn't know you had forgotten. Our elders say that ceremonies are a way we remember to remember, and so sweetgrass is a powerful ceremonial plant cherished by many indigenous nations. It is also used to make beautiful baskets, both medicine and a relative. Its value is both material and spiritual. I have a friend who does beadwork. I do beadwork as well. One of the things that she has made for me is this, and this is Bernie Sanders, the 2020 inauguration. But you can see around this earring, this braid of sweetgrass. She braids sweetgrass around her earrings. I have another one that has seal hide on it because I am of the seal people, and so I have seal earrings that have sweetgrass on them as well. There is such a tenderness in braiding the hair of someone you love. Kindness and something more flow between the braider and the braided, the two connected by the cord of the plait. Wingash, waves and strands, long and shining like a woman's freshly washed hair. So we say it is the flowing hair of Mother Earth. When we braid sweetgrass, we are braiding the hair of Mother Earth, showing her our loving attention, our care for her beauty and well-being, in gratitude for all she has given us. Children hearing the Sky Woman's story from birth know in their bones the responsibility that flows between humans and the earth. This is one of those ways to de-indoctrinate. This is one of those understandings that can give you that understanding of de-indoctrination. Sleepy, I'll point you to a couple people on Facebook. When we are looking at traditional and indigenous methods of understanding the relationship of human with land, this helps us decolonize and de-indoctrinate the thought processes that we have. Many of us have a thought process of ownership, have a thought process of possession. Many of us have been raised in a thought process that the earth was a gift given to us and we hold no responsibility to it, but we can take from it whenever we want. Abyayala is Abyalya. I think, let me type it because I can type it better just so that I can make sure that it's spelled correctly. It's one that it took me forever to get, and I really had and it is shaped like a turtle. That's one of the reasons. Make sure, there we go. That one took me quite some while because especially because I learned it through other people showing me the words, and then I had to listen to people, and I'm very careful. I'm not very careful with English words, but I'm very careful with indigenous words. Children hearing the Sky Woman's story from birth know in their bones the responsibility that flows between humans and the earth. Again, this is one of those decolonization thought processes. There is a responsibility. We like to think of ourselves as having rights, but we never think of ourselves as having responsibility for those rights. Your right to life includes the responsibility to ensure everybody else's right to life. Your right to food ensures the responsibility, or includes the responsibility, that everybody has that right to food. Every right that you have comes with a responsibility in return. It has reciprocity within it. So everything that we like to think that we own or that we have or that we possess, that we can do these things without a return of responsibility, is where that indoctrinated thought process comes in, that teaches you that things are gifts to you and you can do whatever you want with them. Whereas when you look at having rights as having responsibilities, when you look at this as reciprocity, you can see this de-indoctrination. You can find this way through the indoctrinated thought process that teaches you to be greedy, that teaches you to gobble up everything you possibly can because it's all a gift and you can just destroy it, right? Many times we think that gifts are things to destroy. They're not things to take care of. They're not things to cherish. They're not things to actually like provide for, right? They're to provide for us. This is a very colonized concept, a very indoctrinated concept, because when we're looking at the thought process of, possession as opposed to the thought process of reciprocity, the thought process of responsibility, that thought process of possession leads us to this idea that we can destroy the things that we possess instead of understanding that it means that we're supposed to care for. Um, I do not know. So Turtle Island is, of course, the translation into English, right? Um, so that has been around as long as the translation, right? How long the Anishinaabe or the Potawatomi have been using the phrase Turtle Island, or the other nations along the eastern seaboard have been using the phrase Turtle Island, that I could not tell you. We are talking about peoples who have been here for 50,000 years, so not every different nation was the first nation. Like there's a group of people and then everybody's coming off of this, right? And actually there's several different migrations here, right? So I can't state how long Turtle Island. I would state that as long as the Potawatomi and as long as the nations that have used that phrasing have been around would be as long as those phrases were used, right? The story of Sky Woman's journey is so rich and glittering, it feels to me like a deep bowl of celestial blue from which I could drink again and again. It holds our beliefs, our journey, our relationships. Looking into that starry bowl, I see images swirling so fluidly that the past and the present become as one. Images of Sky Woman speak not just of where we came from, but also of how we can go forward. I have Bruce King's portrait of Sky Woman, Moment in Flight, hanging in my lab. Floating to Earth with her handful of seeds and flowers, she looks down on my microscope and data loggers. It might seem an odd juxtaposition, but to me, she belongs there. As a writer, a scientist, and a carrier of Sky Woman's story, I sit at the feet of my elder teachers listening to their songs. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 9:35 a.m., I am usually in a lecture hall at the university, expounding about botany and ecology, trying in short to explain to my students how Sky Woman's gardens, known by some as global ecosystems, function. One otherwise unremarkable morning, I gave the students in my general ecology class a survey. Among other things, they were asked to rate their understanding of the negative interactions between humans and the environment. Nearly every one of the 200 students said confidently that humans and nature are a bad mix. And most of us actually think along those concepts, right? Most of us think that humans and nature are a bad mix because of this indoctrinated thought that we've been dealing with for this 10,000 years of ownership, right? These were third year students who had selected a career in environmental protection, so the response was, in a way, not very surprising. They were well schooled in the mechanics of climate change, toxins in the land and water, and the crisis of habitat loss. Later in the survey, they were asked to rate their knowledge of positive interactions between people and land, and the median response was none. I was stunned. How is it possible that in 20 years of education, they cannot think of any beneficial relationships between people and the environment? Perhaps the negative examples they see every day, brown fields, factory farms, suburban sprawl, trunciated their ability to see some good between humans and the earth. As the land becomes impoverished, so do does the scope of their vision. As the land becomes impoverished, so do does the scope of our vision. When we talked about this after class, I realized that they could not even imagine what beneficial relationships between their species and others might look like. How can we begin to move towards ecological and cultural sustainability if we cannot even imagine what the path feels like? If we can't imagine the generosity of geese? These students were not raised on the story of Sky Woman. On one side of the world were people whose relationship with the living world was shaped by Sky Woman, who created a garden for the well being of all. On the other side was a woman with a garden and a tree. But for tasting its fruit, she was banished from the garden, and the gates clanged shut behind her. That mother of man was made to wander in the wilderness and earn her bread by the sweat of her brow, not by filling her mouth with the sweet, juicy fruits that bend the branches low. In order to eat, she was instructed to subdue the wilderness into which she was cast. Same species, same earth, different stories. Like creation stories everywhere, cosmologies are a source of identity and orientation to the world. They tell us who we are. We are inevitably shaped by them, no matter how distant they may be from our consciousness. One story leads to the generous embrace of the living world, the other to banishment. One woman is our ancestral gardener, a co creator of the good green world that would be the home of her descendants. The other was an exile, just passing through an alien world on a rough road to her real home in heaven. And then they met, the offspring of Sky Woman and the children of Eve. And the land around us bears the scars of that meeting, the echoes of our stories. They say that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and I can only imagine the conversation between Eve and Sky Woman. Sister, you got the short end of the stick. I want to reread a couple things within here because these are really important, especially when we're understanding our decolonization and de-indoctrination. Same species, same earth, different stories. Like creation stories everywhere, cosmologies are a source of identity and orientation to the world. They tell us who we are. So they shape our thoughts of who we are as people. We are inevitably shaped by them, no matter how distant they may be from our conscious. Even those of us who do not follow a Christian thought process or a Judaic thought process or an Islamic thought process are still shaped by these thought processes. They're the thought processes that shaped our governments. They're the thought process that shaped the main part of the world. I'm globally mixed and I'm indigenous to Turtle Island. One story leads to the generous embrace of the living world and the other to banishment. One woman is our ancestral gardener, a co-creator of the good green world that would be the home of her descendants. The other was just an exile, just passing through an alien world on a rough road to her real home in heaven. This is the line that I want you to actually really listen to, right? One woman is our ancestral gardener, a co-creator of the good green world that would be the home of her descendants. A co-creator involved in the creation of, right? The other was an exile, just passing through an alien world on a rough road to her real home in heaven. When you stay in a hotel, you don't care how much you trash it. When you stay in somebody else's house, you're less likely to care how much you trash it. When we are not in our home, we don't take care of it as much as we do our home. Oftentimes, this even translates to rental versus home ownership, right? If you're renting a home, you're way less likely to be providing a lot of the upkeep and the care for it. Whereas if you're buying a home or you own a home, you provide the care for it, right? So when you view something as not your home, but a place that you're exiled to, then you have this need to, instead of providing for it, tending it, and caring for it, you don't have that need. You can trash it. You don't care. If it's not your home, you don't care as much. Just like if something is not earned, we tend to care less about it, right? So children who are taught to believe that this is a space of exile, that they're just passing through, that their real home is somewhere else, do not take care of this space. Whereas those who are taught that they are the co-creator of this space, that everything about this space has to do with how they interact with this space, have a tendency to care for it better, right? So we talked about how to decolonize. If you are of European descendant, you cannot, and you are in a diaspora, you're not able to decolonize that space yourself. You need to work on the thought process decolonization. You need to decolonize your thought process, which is what we were just talking about, right? How to decolonize your thought process, or different ways of decolonization, though we came about this from the phrase Turtle Island. Once you have started to decolonize your thought process, to change the indoctrination of thought that you are dealing with, right? Then you can go to the local communities who are currently colonized. Here in the United States, that would be your local indigenous nations, your local Native American nations. And in going to those spaces, there are ways to do this. You go in and you don't say, hey, I'm here to do this, this, and this, and I know what you need, because that's really white savory and really icky of you. But say you have skills and you have talent. Say you're really good at carpentry. So you go in and you go, listen, I'm really good at carpentry and I really, really want to help you to achieve sovereignty, to achieve land back, to achieve the goals that your nation needs for stability. What can I do to help? And that is how you can help a local nation decolonize. There are indigenous nations across the globe. They're not just indigenous people here in Turtle Island in Canada, in Mexico. There are indigenous people in South America or Abya. There are indigenous people in Scandinavia, the Sami. There are indigenous people in Japan, the Ainu. There are indigenous people in Africa, the Amazigh. There are indigenous people in spaces across the globe. Pakistanis or Palestinians, not Pakistanis. So Pakistanis probably are. I just haven't looked. Palestinians are indigenous because they are the descendants of Canaan, who are the indigenous people of the area of Palestine, right? There are indigenous Ukrainians are indigenous people. There are indigenous people in indigenous nations across the globe. Within the island of Britain, there are the Cymry, the Cyrnau, and the Scots. There are also, underneath British control in some spaces, the Irish Gaelic. These are indigenous groups. These are all indigenous groups who are fighting for decolonization, fighting for recognition of their own forms of government and systems, right? So when we are looking at decolonizing as a European descendant in a diaspora, when you are a member of the nation that colonized, the way that you help decolonize is by decolonizing your thought process and then going to the people who are trying to retain their own rights, retain their own sovereignty, retain their own space, and doing their best to help them do that. Doing your best to help them do that. Again, without telling them what they need to do, your ideas are not helpful, but with giving the skills that you bring to the table so that they don't have to pick them out of the blue, right? Um, Zero competition is really easy. So there was 80 to 100 million here in Turtle Island when Europeans arrived. That's the archaeological understanding is that there was 80 to 100 million. Um, and all of those 80 to 100 million were fed. And all of those 80 to 100 million were fed using a theory and a practice called honorable harvest by many. And that actually, this actually goes into it. Braiding sweetgrass actually goes into honorable harvest. Honorable harvest is about gathering during times when the plant is entering into hibernation. So times of pruning, you know how like if you garden and you do roses, you prune your roses back every year. So during these times of pruning is when you're going to gather the fruits and vegetables of the land, right? The old or the sick or who you're killing when you're hunting. During these times of pruning, you're gathering. You don't take more than you need. You take enough for you, right? Take enough for your family. You might preserve some stuff, but you don't take more than you need and you leave it for others to be able to take it, right? So if we were not focused on competition, like main character is saying, we can focus on important things, right? We can be efficient in the way, like currently, we have more than enough food to feed everybody in the United States for free. We really do. Instead, we throw out the food. We really like. I don't know if you read, but like at the start of the pandemic, they were literally dumping gallons and gallons of milk rather than giving it out for free, right? We literally destroy food rather than giving it away because we want to create competition. We want to create scarcity because if we can make you think that something is scarce, then we can make you pay higher for it. We can make you trade an ephemeral thing that doesn't matter for something that matters, right? If we can make you think that it has a greater value, we can get you to trade these little slips of paper that don't matter for something that really matters, right? And so when we're looking at a lack of competition, what we're seeing is that a community coming together to feed the whole. When you're talking to archaeologists or anthropologists, historians, they will tell you that civilization starts when a community has an abundance of food. And I would argue that, well, yes, things start when people have an abundance of food. It is not civilized until that abundance of food is with every person fed. So when we get to Turtle Island, we see that the Europeans document what is going on here in Turtle Island. And how they document what is going on is they document nations, vast million people nations where everybody is fed, where all of the elders are fed. Nobody is without safe space. No, and I don't mean everybody gets a little safe space. I mean, nobody is without a home, a roof over their head, and warmth in the winter, where all of the children have food and have families. Whether or not they're orphaned, they have people caring for them and they are all fed. Where there is nobody without food, where there is nobody without health, and where there is nobody without a home, right? So that is not something that forms in competition, it is something that forms in unity. When I care more about making sure that everybody is safe than I care about getting one up on you, then everybody is safe. And this is what we're seeing in indigenous communities across the globe. This is an animistic concept. Now, I want to double down and always need to on the fact that nothing is monolithic. Not all indigenous communities of Turtle Island are the same. Not all indigenous communities of Abayala are the same. The Sami and the Turtle Island indigenous people may have similarities, but they're not the same. The Ainu, they may have similarities, they're not the same. A really good way to talk about this is pretty much every culture has a smoke cleansing within the culture, right? We see this even within Catholicism. Catholicism uses incenses to smoke cleanse. Smoke cleansing is something that is pretty across the globe, but not every culture smoke cleanses in the same way. And not every culture uses the same tools to smoke cleanse. Whereas you might find people on the western seaboard of the United States and Canada, indigenous groups who smoke cleanse using sage, white sage. You might find people in the center who are smoke cleansing using sweetgrass, and you might find people up north who are smoke cleansing using cedar, right? They're all smoke cleansing, but they are using different things to smoke cleanse. We don't believe that anybody carries these views white. That's why we're talking about them. So we cannot change this without changing concept. And we've done it before. We've done it frequently. We've changed our thought process. If we change the way we thought, we've done this before. We're 300,000 years as a species, and violence is 10,000 years old. And the idea of Western thought and monoculture and all this monocrop stuff, that's only 10,000 years old. That's 290,000 years that we were as a species before we changed to this concept. And this concept's only 10,000 years old in certain spaces. In some spaces, it still doesn't exist. There are indigenous nations that still have not been colonized across the globe. So in some spaces, it still doesn't exist. So if we were able to change to this once, we can change away from it. And currently we are, especially like in many nations. Currently we see this shift away from Christianity. We see this shift away from monotheism. A lot of that shift away from monotheism is because of the fact that there's no reciprocity in monotheism. There's no give and take in monotheism, and because of the very narrow view of perfection that we see in monotheism. We're already seeing a shift of understanding. We see the shift of understanding in agriculture when we start looking at ecological practices. We've been working very hard within the last 50, 60 years to build up, what is the terminology? It's like green gardening, but that's not the terminology. It's an eco safe practice. But we've been shifting, and these are actually indigenous practices that we're shifting our thought process back into, right? So yeah, using of healing herbs, which we thought was witchcraft for a long time, but now we know that it's not, right? Sustainability, but sustainability is not the word. It's an ecological word, and it starts with eco something, and I can't remember the word off. I'm word poor, like I'm word rich, but I'm word poor. It's part of my mental health issues. So we're already shifting, right? And a part of why I'm here is to help that shift. If I can give you what I've learned in 40 something odd years through extensive study and maybe make you see something new, then maybe I can help you shift that thought process, right? if I can reach 28,000 people, then 28,000 people are starting to shift their permaculture. Thank you. Are starting to shift their concept, right? And permaculture is literally indigenous agriculture. I found this book because I did an indigenous gardening class in college. I was looking for things to do as, like uh, extra not extra credit, extracurriculars, right? Not extracurriculars. What are they? Anyways, those different little credits that you need that are on top of the credits that you need, right? And so I grew up indigenous. I've been indigenous my whole life, and I was taught indigenous healing as a child, and I was taught indigenous biology, or medicine, and herbology as a child. And because of that, like I spent my childhood, I can remember toddling around behind my mama, helping her pick herbs, and talking to the earth and talking to the plants. And I would sing and made up languages in my head to the plants as I was, and giving tobacco as I was, taking stuff in honorable harvest. I was taught honorable harvest before I was taught anything else. It wasn't titled that, but that's how I was taught. And so I went, okay, well, indigenous gardening, I lose things. And so, like, more knowledge of herbs, because I've lost half of that knowledge of herbs. Just like I no longer know Hebrew, I've lost half of my herbal knowledge. So I'll take this indigenous gardening class. This will help me bring back my knowledge of herbs, and it will be something that's soothing for me to take. At the same time, I took a philosophy of ethics class, which was the worst class that I could probably ever take, because the philosophy of ethics class was based on Christian ethics. And the whole thought process behind the philosophy of ethics class was, can you have ethics without God? Which, let me tell you, was not my class to take. So I took that class and this class at the same time. And throughout that class, I got to a point, like probably 3 or 4 weeks into the class, that I literally could not read any of the stuff that was tossed at me without, I'd throw it across the room and pick up Braiding Sweetgrass, because it was the only thing that could calm me. Because as I was reading people talk about how it should be okay to kill people off because ethics states it's okay to kill off, I would just sit there and go, oh, take your God and shove him, because yuck. And so I would like, this was how I would like decompress and how I relax. And so it was perfectly the fortuitous time for me to be taking that class, right? But that's how I found Braiding Sweetgrass. And the teacher of that class, Judy Bluehorse Skelton, who is an amazing Indigenous human being who is so into activism, into reclaiming culture, into reclaiming ecology, she brought up the fact that we think of permaculture as this new thing, but permaculture is indigenous. It's just appropriated and renamed. So, hello. So when we're looking at things, we look at some of these things as new concepts, but really what they are is they're a return to old concepts. Same thing with medicine, as somebody was mentioning. We're looking at herbology. We're looking at things like I get acupuncture. We're looking at these different things that are ancient. Ancient herbology goes back to the Neanderthals, and acupuncture can be seen in Otzi's tattoos, right? Ancient theories of medicine and healing that we have decided are no good because they're indigenous thought processes, right? And so currently within medicine, we're bringing many of these concepts back into medicine, and we're starting to relearn, and we're starting to re-understand, and we're starting to do this. And as we're starting to do this, it's shifting our brain, it's shifting our understanding, it's shifting our concept, right? Now, many times we have to weed out what is appropriated, right? What is being renamed, what is not new age, but is actually old age, right? Sometimes we have to kind of weed that shit out. Yet, even if we're not weeding that shit out, we are still shifting our concepts. We're still shifting our understanding. When I did nerve conduction studies, one of the people that did the guy that did the nerve conduction studies, we were talking, and I was I'm VA because I'm a disabled war vet, and my doctor, my PCP with the VA, she does something called combat acupuncture. And this is where you can put acupuncture needles in people's ears, and you can like wear them for weeks, and you can adjust them for the pain that you're in. And she had been talking to me about it. So I was talking to him about it, right? And about the fact that some of these things are shifting. And he's like, yeah, all this new age medicine. And I'm like, well, actually, you're the new age medicine. And he's like, huh. And I'm like, if you think about it, these are traditional medicines that go back thousands and thousands of years. Modern medicine is a couple hundred years old, right? In here, I've heard it. There is a beautiful indigenous creator in here who does medical anthropology, though currently their focus is they're a two-spirit, and currently their focus is very much on MMIW and the landfill in Canada that is the Manitoba landfill that needs to be searched, right? But they do medical anthropology, and they stated that it's allopathy versus naturopathy. So allopathy is the modern medicine, naturopathy is old medicine, right? So if we can shift and understand that the old medicine is the old medicine and that the new medicine is really a modern understanding and oftentimes appropriated and very frequently not very healthy, then we can start that decolonization and de-indoctrination of our brain around medicine, right? So we start here and then we can move here and then we can move there. I'm sorry, William, why would you even? What happened in Abu Ghraib was horrific. 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 There is no reason for anybody to torture anybody. None. And what we're talking about in here is removing that concept and that thought process that it's okay to be violent towards other people. Now, Abu Ghraib happened after I left Iraq and after I left the military. I don't know what would have happened if I had been in that situation. I was not an MP, I was an engineer. I don't know what would have happened, right? Yet it was horrific on every level. And I would argue that it was also horrific for the soldiers. Now, the torture that they committed was absolutely horrific. The mindset that they had to be indoctrinated into and the belief that they had to follow these orders was also horrific for them, right? So the entirety of it is a problem. The belief that that is okay is a problem, and the belief that that is okay or what you should do creates a significant amount of mental health issue in a person. And the victims were also dealing with severe issues of trauma, right? This is the same thing like earlier when I was talking about just how much toxic gender roles hurt men, right? Rape culture is as harmful for men as it is for women. And the reasoning is because the concept in your mind that you are owed a woman is harmful. It's a mental health issue, right? The concept that you are owed a woman in your head is an issue within your head. It's a mental defect, right? Created by society, and you can absolutely get out of that mental defect. But these issues, they don't just hurt the victim, they hurt the perpetrator too, right? These are not who we are. Humans biologically are nurturing and communal. That is who we are innately. When we have deviated from that, the pain of that deviation is not just within the victims, but within the perpetrators. The twist that your brain has to go through to think that it's okay to harm somebody else is a mental health issue that should be addressed as a mental health defect, as a mental health issue, right? That's true, Micah. If you think you're owed anybody, it's a sure sign you don't deserve them. So when we are looking at trying to change that indoctrination and trying to change the colonization and to decolonize our minds and to decolonize, to help others to decolonize space, a very huge way that we can do that is things like looking at medicine, looking at ecology, looking at so history is a problematic thing because history is not always written right? History, unlike oral tradition, which is typically more true and more correct than written history, history is very problematic. So not necessarily towards history, but looking towards archaeology, anthropology, right? Why do you think I think I'm owed half of your money? I said I'm a disabled war vet. The income that I get is because of what the military did to me. I've earned it. I was locked in a tent by my sergeant and assaulted for 6 weeks in Kuwait. I've earned every penny I get. And you don't pay for jack shit. Okay. And your idea that people on welfare are the problem, you pay $5,000 a year for a military industrial complex and $35 a year so children get to eat. And if you think that you paying $35 a year so a child can eat is the fucking problem, then you need to go to counseling. How dare you? That's a lack of compassion. That's a lack of empathy. That's a lack of humanity. And if you think having to pay $35 a year so a child can eat is the fucking problem, then you are the problem. So, when we're looking at trying to get rid of the indoctrinated, colonized thought process, this is a good way to start. Looking at and when we look at them, what we must understand is that, sorry, I'm going to sneeze on you. We can't look at them as just the face value. So take permaculture. When we look at permaculture, we can see that this is something that needs to be changed, right? This is a way that we need to move. But if we look at it just as permaculture, as a new creation, as something that somebody just did, then we're not shifting our thought process, right? But if we look at permaculture and see that permaculture is rehashing, basically, is the best, not the best way to put it, but the nicest way to put it, right? Instead of looking at it as an appropriation, if we're looking at it as a rehashing of indigenous permaculture, of indigenous honorable harvest, then we can start to look at it through new lights. If we just continue to look at it through the same indoctrinated thought process, right? It's land, we own it, God gave it to us. It's, a fucking exile that we're going through to get to our home in heaven, right? If we consider along that same concept, then we're not shifting our thinking. But if we're looking at it, we're going, okay, so where does this come from? Why are we doing this? Where is this from originally? What does this do? How does this function? Why does it function? What should we be doing instead? Why are we being reciprocal, right? When we're looking at it in those ways, it shifts our concept. And it is those very, very tiny shifts in our concept that change it. Squirrel, let's look at Hamas. Hamas is not the terrorist organization in the area. IDF is a terrorist organization. They're on the terrorist watch list. Hamas killed 1,400 people, and since then, 6,000 people have been killed. 6,000 people. They are carpet bombing Gaza. They are carpet bombing Gaza, and children, babies, infants are being smithereened. So before you come in here and start yelling shit like that at me, I want you to take a look at the real. It probably did surpass 7,000 today. I want you to take a look at the real truth. There is a nation that is colonizing another nation. There are people that were refugees in a nation, were paid by the US government to rise up and overthrow the government in the nation that they were refugees in, created their own space, and have been genociding the indigenous group of that space for the next 100 years. And if somebody rises up against genocide of their people, they are not the terrorists. The terrorists are the committers of the genocide. So you can take your Islamophobia and racism somewhere else. Children are dying, and it is not Hamas doing it. Children are dying in the thousands, and it is not Hamas doing it. Have a great one. So when we are looking at that shift of thought process, when we shift our thought process into the idea, really, how many people did they kill? I want you to answer me 3 questions. How many people were killed by Hamas, and how many people were killed by IDF? This month alone. Not all the people that were killed by IDF over the last 100 years, but all the people that are killed in this month alone. Not all the people killed by IDF in 2008. Not all the people killed by IDF in 2005. Not all the people IDF killed in 2010 or 2020. All the people killed in the last month by IDF compared to all the people killed by Hamas. I want you to answer me that question first. And then what I want you to do, no, you're revising it because you're an Islamophobe and a racist. Islam is a better religion than Christianity is every day of the week. It preaches more love and compassion. Islam was educating women before Christianity was educating women. Christianity is still killing trans people, still killing gay people, still killing pretty much everybody, and still killing women. We just voted in killing women this fucking last year. We voted in killing women, right? Your country votes in killing women and votes in killing gay people, right? And you're pissed at Arabs, you're pissed at Muslims. There are more words of love in the Quran than there are in the Bible. What book? It's all the same fucking book. It's all founded on the same God. They're all the same worshipers of the same God. There is no holy war and no genocide without Yahweh. Israel is currently in the midst of a genocide and a holy war that they are committing. And your problem is with the people they're genociding because you don't like their religion. That means that you're morally and ethically decrepit. You have no morals and no ethics. You think it's okay to kill children as long as they're brown children. And they're not even brown children. You just think that they're brown children. You think that it's okay to kill children as long as you think they're brown children. That's some serious indoctrination. You can take your racism and your Islamophobia anywhere else but here. This was not the subject we were on, but I can get on that subject really quick. Palestinians are the descendants of Canaan. They are the indigenous people of that land, and Israel has been colonizing them for 3,000 years and is currently committing a genocide where they have locked them into ghettos, refusing to allow them to leave, and they are carpet bombing 2 million people, of which 1 million are children and 500,000 are under the age of 12. They are carpet bombing. Hamas killed 1,400 adults and children. Israel, since then alone, has killed 7,000. I saw 9,000. I haven't looked. Yes, Israel actually documents the original colonization that they made of Canaan. They document it in the book of Joshua. They document the atrocities that they commit against the Canaanites. And you've read it. We've all read it. We've all heard of it our entire fucking life. It is their holy land, and they used manifest destiny because God said they could have it. And they said there are people there, and God said, oh, well, kill them. Because your God is God of war and death and destruction and genocide. He likes you to kill. The more blood you shed in his name, the happier he is. That space has been under foreign occupation by Israel for 3,000 years. Yeah, he is. Well, and have you seen all the shit coming out too? You know that they've attacked Lebanon 3 times in the last 100 years. Once they got their hold, and as refugees overthrew the government with our backing and got their hold in that area, they started attacking Lebanon too, because they want Lebanon and they want Jordan as well, because it's not enough to have just Jerusalem, right? So in the last 2 days, they have decided to announce to the world that Lebanon is bombing them. So they have started bombing Lebanon too. Israel is not only bombing Gaza, but they're bombing Lebanon at this point. And they've used propaganda and false claims to do it. Widda is, to my finding, the oldest etymology of the word witch. Wid is knowledge, and means feminine, so it is knowledge of the feminine. The Druids, of which I believe the Widda to be a part of, are the scientists, the healers, the teachers, the lawyers, and the priests of the ancient Celts. Widda is from that. So when we're looking at this shift of understanding, this is another one of those shifts of understanding. Just because a people has been genocided does not mean that they have the right to genocide another people. Just because a people has been genocided does not give them the right to genocide another people. Just because a people has been genocided does not give them the right to genocide another people. Just because a people has been genocided does not give them the right to genocide another people. And if you want to talk about babies dying, then we need to talk about what Israel is doing. There's no two ways around that. Really? Tell me how many times the Gazans have bombed Israel. Gazians are actually Palestinians, and that is their land. They are fighting off a foreign occupation. And that's not true. It's the other way around is the truth. If you actually know anything of what's going on in that area. Even our own accounts show that Gaza has been bombed by Israel for the last, since 1967. How do you harass people that overthrew your government and took your land? If you come into my house, if I go into your house and sit my ass on the couch and decide that you're not going to eat your food and I'm going to assign you your bedroom. You only get to stay in your bedroom. Every once in a while, you can come out and go to the bathroom. I'm in your house. Okay. If you telling me to get the fuck out, is that harassing me? Is that harassing me? You telling me to get out of your house? It's not two houses. It was one house. It was one house. It was Palestine until the refugees overthrew it. Know your history. Know your history. It was never Israel's land. It was always Palestine's land. I'm going by your Bible, dude. I'm going by your Bible. I'm going by the actual history of the world. DNA states that it belongs to the Palestinians because the Palestinians are the descendants of Canaan. DNA states that. And the Bible states that they colonized it, that the Israelites colonized Canaan. That's according to the Bible. It's according to the Torah. Your own documents state what I'm stating. Your own documents state what I'm saying. Your cognitive disconnect is huge. When you have decided that your own history that you document isn't the truth, your cognitive disconnect is huge. When you decide that the history that you document, is untrue, your cognitive disconnect is huge. The Judaic people were brought to Palestine as refugees. They were given refuge in Palestine. It was from that base of refuge that they overthrew the government and started killing people. They got a Canaanite genetic sample from archaeology, and Canaanites, there's like 5 Canaanite graves that they have the genetic sample from. And the Lebanese and the Palestinians are the descendants of the Canaanites. That's through archaeology and anthropology and DNA. The Lebanese and the Palestinians are the descendants of the Canaanites. The Judaic people come from either a river in Jordan, the Amman River in Jordan, which is where Shem came from, or which is in Mesopotamia, which is where Abraham came from. Neither of those is Canaan. Neither of those is Palestine. That's the documentation of the Judaic people. That's their own history. Yeah, I think it's actually Engazal, which we talk about Engazal in its first iteration here. We've talked about that because Engazal starts at like 9,000 years ago and then it dies after 300 years. But there was a second Engazal, and the river in Jordan is called Amman, and the city was called Engazal, and that is where Shem was from. Shem was from the city of En-Gazal along a river in Jordan, and Abraham was from Ur in Mesopotamia. Neither of those are Palestine. Allah is Yahweh. Allah and Yahweh and God are all the same deity. The Torah is the foundation book of the Quran and the Bible. These are all followers of the same God. He's a nasty, icky God. He's a war God. He's a destruction God. He's a God of holy war and genocide, and he demands blood in his name. But it is the same God for all three of them. They all follow the same God. They all follow the same book. There are some additions in a couple of them, but they all follow the same God and they all follow the same book. Palestinians are the genetic descendants of Canaan. No, they're not Philistines. The Philistine thought process has been debunked. They're not the descendants of the Philistines. They're the descendants of the Canaanites. That's the blood descendancy. That's the DNA descendancy. The Lebanese and the Palestinians are descendant from Canaan. Whereas the Israelites come from Mesopotamia or Jordan, depending on how far back you want to take it, right? If you take it back to Shem, who is the founder of all of Israel, right? Shem is from En-Gazal in Jordan. And if you take it back to Abraham, who is the founding father in some lights, then we're talking Ur in Mesopotamia. I don't know where the Philistines went to. That's not a topic for conversation in this, because the fact that the Philistines' DNA isn't seen in any of the three people we're talking about. Philistines died off. We're not talking about the Philistines. We're talking about the Canaanites. He came from Ur. That's the documentation for Abraham is from Ur. I don't think Samaria and Mesopotamia are the same. They could be. They're roughly the same region. Maps are hard for me. You're no older than anybody else. Yes, we all come like the origin of our species is in Africa, but we're all the same age as a species, dude. We're all the same age as a species. Certain adaptations come later, but we're all the same age as a species. Every single one of us. And Africa, the indigenous people of North Africa are light as I am. The Amazigh people, they're as light as I am, and they are the indigenous people of North Africa. They are the indigenous people from the space that we found the first Homo sapien. The earliest Homo sapien is 300,000 years old, and it's from Morocco in North Africa. And the indigenous people of Morocco and North Africa are light of skin. The Amazigh are the Tamazight people. And we're all the same age. We're just all the same age. It's a weird concept to think that you're older than I am just because, I mean, especially if we live in the same country, like to think that you're older than I am just because your skin is a different color than mine. That's not true. Like certain people have lived in certain regions for certain periods of time. Absolutely. I've lived in this region for 50,000 years. My ancestors have lived in this region for 50,000 years. That doesn't mean that I'm older than anybody. Have a great one, Maya. And Turtle Island indigenous people are 50,000 years on this land. And we were not phenotypically Black. The transatlantic slave trade happened. It is a horror that you should not excuse the white people for committing. You should not erase it so that the white people don't have to take accountability for it. The Europeans committed the transatlantic slave trade. And that should be known and acknowledged, because if we don't know and acknowledge that, then we don't hold them accountable for the atrocity, which means the atrocity can happen again. That's not true. The Amazigh are not dark of skin. And in North Africa, even prior to colonization, the Egyptians weren't phenotypically black. They were brown, but they weren't black, right? That's just not the way it goes. That's not how that's not how genetics works. That's not how adaptation works. That's not how that's not how humanity works. As Neil deGrasse Tyson will tell you, prior to colonization, Africa had every skin color known to man. And that comes from Neil deGrasse Tyson. So, right. I am actually an anthropologist and an archaeologist. I study genetics, but it is not my field of expertise. So I know genetics and I know information having to do with genetics as it relates to archaeology and anthropology. But I'm not a geneticist, right? Actually, um, some Egyptians, the Nubians that were in Egypt, were as dark as the Nubians, but many Egyptians prior to the colonization of Egypt, which starts at roughly 200 or 2000 BC, right? Many Egyptians were actually lighter of skin. As you look back through what has been put on the paper, not papers, what is put on the hieroglyphs and what is put on the walls from the very earliest kings, that you will see that many of them are brown instead of black phenotypically, right? That there are actually many different colors within Egypt, Kemet itself. When you look at Kemet and you look at the history of Kemet and you look at the archaeology of Kemet and you look at the hieroglyphs within Kemet, right? And we are all human. We are all human. We are all Homo sapiens. We're all one people and one race. If we could just get that thought process through our mind, we'd be doing a little bit better. So I'm going to go ahead and take off. We'll go over what I usually talk. We have what we call mitochondrial eaves. Mitochondrial eaves are the originators of a DNA line. So we have mitochondrial DNA, like somebody's mitochondrial DNA, like my mitochondrial DNA is a fucking list, but somebody's mitochondrial DNA might be C1, which is a common mitochondrial DNA in Turtle Island. Somebody's mitochondrial DNA might be C1. So the mitochondrial eve for the C line of the DNA would be the ancestor of all of the C line of the DNA, the grandmother, and all of the children that come from her, right? When we're looking at Y DNA, the masculine line, we have what we call a Y atom as well. So we do have an originator of each DNA line. We don't know the originator of each DNA line. Using DNA, they're able to do generations through DNA. And so they've been able to trace back when the originator of each line is. And sometimes they can trace where. Like, so we know that the Y DNA from the Picts can also be seen in the Iberian Peninsula and can also be seen in Turkey. In fact, the highest concentration of the Y DNA from the Picts is seen in Turkey, which supports the stories of the Picts coming over, right? So we can trace where mitochondrial DNA or where Y DNA has come from, and we can trace it back and back and back. Like we know that C comes from B, comes from A. We know that L is the oldest, and L in Africa then becomes M right outside of Africa, then becomes N, then becomes O, and this is a mitochondrial DNA that we can watch as it translates across the globe. We do know the foundation, like the generation of the foundation of the L DNA, the generation of the foundation of the M DNA, the generation of the foundation of the O DNA, and these would be the mDNA foundation would be the mitochondrial eve for mDNA. The qDNA foundation would be the mitochondrial eve for the qDNA, and so on and so forth. So we have traced them back to a mitochondrial eve or a Y atom, but there is no such thing as a singular start. So even in our start, like we know now that we come from an convergence of many different species instead of a singular origin of our species, and that convergence happens in Africa. The oldest that we find of our species is in North Africa, Morocco, at 300,000 years. Over the next 100,000 years, we find, I think, 2 or 3 other finds across Africa. Our current understanding is that how we origin as a species is at the timeline, we're seeing people living in bands. Now, bands and tribes are two words that we use for community, and people confuse this. Tribe means a community based on genetic lineage. So your citizenship in the community is based on your genes. And band is a community not based on genetic lineage. So we see that Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo antisus, these different species of humans are all living together in these bands and intermixing, and those intermixing starts creating Homo sapiens. We see that Homo sapien gets created in 2 to 3 different groups. And as Homo sapien, 2 or 3 here, 2 or 3 there, 2 or 3 there are all created, we see that they eventually end up coming together. Right. And as they eventually end up coming together, we see that there's a solidification of our species as a singular species, as a species whole between 125 to 130,000 years ago. Um, so we come from a convergence of many different species. We don't come from a singular origin. We do all come from a convergence in Africa, though, right? So let me know if that muted me because somebody tried to call me, right? And Africa itself is not exclusively Black prior to colonization. Due to the genetic testing of, or the DNA full genome testing, or not testing, but the DNA work that has been done on Homo sapiens in Africa prior to colonization or pre colonization, we can see that Homo sapiens within Africa pre colonization have 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA that comes from them being in Africa, and that comes from where we mixed with Neanderthals the most, which happened in the Levant area and the Arabian Peninsula for 100,000 years. And as we're mixing in that space, people who are Homo sapien are taking those genes of Neanderthal back into Africa, and people who are Neanderthal are taking those genes up into Eurasia. So we see that as Homo sapien is migrating back into Africa and they're taking those genes, this leads to prior to colonization, there being 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA in everybody in Africa except for 2 populations, the only 2 populations on this planet that don't have Neanderthal DNA. Those are the Kwe of South Africa and the Yoruba of East Africa. They have 3 ghost species in them. Ghost species, we see roughly 7 of them across the globe. And they do not have Neanderthal DNA, but they do have ghost species. Those are the only 2 places that don't have Neanderthal DNA. And when we're looking at the genomes of people in Africa prior to colonization, we see that people in Africa prior to colonization have different alleles for skin tone. Skin tone is something that is not based just on genetics. It also is based on the environment that the mother is in when she is pregnant. And what it shows us is that there is evidence, and we have seen 2 white people having a Black child. There's a famous case, Sandra Lang. There are many Black people who have lighter children. This is having to do with the environment during pregnancy, many other things. But we see in people prior to colonization in Africa that the alleles for light skin are there in many different groups. The Amazi, what we know of as the Berber is slur. The Amazi or Tamazi people are light-skinned people prior to colonization, and they are North African. Egypt, prior to colonization, was a multitude of skin tones, a multitude. Did I say East Africa? I might have said East Africa. Sorry, it is West Africa. It is West Africa for the Yoruba. I might have said East Africa. I'm so geographically challenged. So we see that there are a multitude of skin tones. The alleles for light skin are present in people in Africa and prevalent, as in like in an individual, the alleles for light skin outweigh the alleles for dark skin, prevalent within individuals in Africa prior to colonization. So we see not only do you see all skin tones in Africa prior to colonization, you see all heights in Africa prior to colonization. And you can also see different eye colors in Africa prior to colonization. Eye color is a little bit different because eye color is more dependent on sunlight than skin color is. Skin color is an adaptation for receiving more vitamin C or less vitamin C, and it protects or doesn't protect from UV rays. Lighter skin will keep you warmer. Darker skin will help dissipate heat better. So when we're looking at those things, we're seeing that light eyes are coming first because light eyes, you see better in a low light environment when you have light eyes. You see better in a high light environment when you have dark eyes. And so we see that there is less of a fluctuation of eye color. out of Africa, as in we left Africa at 150,000 years ago, and everybody outside of Africa that left at 150,000 years ago advanced further and evolved further than everybody inside of Africa, and we evolved separately from each other is absolute BS. That is what has been debunked. The idea that Homo sapien as a species all comes from Africa and all starts in Africa has never been debunked. That is the current knowledge. There is what we call multi-regional speciation, and that is different species of human, like Neanderthal and Denisovan, that speciated from Homo erectus outside of Africa. This is multi-regional speciation. So both our species origin in Africa and multi-regional speciation are correct. The idea that we left Africa 150,000 years ago, everybody, but those who are currently inside of Africa, and that those who left evolved further and are therefore more advanced is completely racist and completely incorrect. The current knowledge is that no, first of all, Africa, roughly halfway through our time as a species, Africa as a continent is bigger than we think of it. So, because of the way that when we're in a full glaciation period, sea levels lower, the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea are gone at 150,000 years ago. So, when we're looking at the Levant area and we're looking at the Arabian Peninsula during this time frame, they're connected to Africa still. So at 150,000 years ago, Homo sapien moves into this area. In this area, Neanderthal is living as well. We actually have a space where we lived in two caves, a 5-minute walk from each other for 100,000 years. It's a great time of information for us. It's a great time of our brains expanding. It's a great time of our tool usage is expanding. It's when we start to find art. It's when we start to bury our dead. It's when we start to have identity. And in this time, for 100,000 years, we're living in this space. And then roughly 50,000 years ago, we start moving outside and moving into other regions. So you might see now at 70,000 years ago, we see that Indigenous Australians make it to Australia. We see that Indigenous Turtle Islanders have been here for 50,000 years. So they probably left around 60,000 years ago from the Levant area because they spent about 10,000 years intermixing with the Denisovians to get the 1.02 to 0.03% Denisovian DNA that you see in Indigenous Turtle Islanders, North America, and Indigenous Aboriginal, South America. And so they probably are leaving the area around 60,000 years ago to get to Turtle Island at 50,000 years ago. We're seeing that the first Homo sapiens modern humans that we see in Western Eurasia is roughly 50,000 years ago as well. And we see that we find modern humans in Asia at roughly that time period too. We do see some finds prior to that, but these are extinct lineages of modern human. They're not related to us. So when we're looking at this, this is why out of Africa theory has been debunked. It is not that we didn't all origin in Africa. It is that we didn't all leave Africa at 150,000 years ago and somehow become more advanced than the people who were within Africa. That is the part that has been debunked. And it should be noted that the adaptation of skin tone that is the genetic advantage is not light skin. It is dark skin. You can go into any space in any region with dark skin and live. You cannot go into any space in any region with light skin and live healthily. So the genetic advantage is actually dark skin. The genetic advantage is not light skin. The real genetic advantage is our ability to adapt. So back to what I was saying as I'm trying to get out of here. When we are looking at us as a species, we know that we are nurturing and communal biologically. Biologically, we are nurturing and communal as a species. We know this because we have mandatory midwifery and because we have 5 life stages from neonate to adult. Mandatory midwifery means that we must have somebody help us give birth to our children because of the way our children are built, like the head and shoulders and our pelvic outlet. And we also know that we have what we call life stages. Life stages, they count from birth to fully formed adult. You can go out on your own, you can do your own thing. Of every species on the planet, we have the longest growth period as children. This contributes to our intelligence, contributes to our brain malleability, and gives us the ability to understand new concepts like we do. The 5 life stages currently is a 25-year period. It's probably like 15 to 20 years, 100,000 years ago, right? But in that 5 life stages from neonate to adult, we have to have a community to nurture us. It's not just something one person can do, not even today. even as a single parent, which I have been, even then, it's not one person doing it, right? You still need an employer, you still need a daycare worker, you still need, somebody who's getting the food and bringing it to the store so you can buy the food so you can bring it home to cook it, right? So there are still many people that you need as a part of the community to bring a child from neonate to adult. Currently, it takes a village, which is such an old saying, but we ignore it all the time because it takes a village. And because as we were before, we needed at least 30 people to raise any singular child from neonate to adult in a time when we're hunting, in a time when we have to get the things that we need to make tools, in a time when, a child's cries are going to alert a predator. We need roughly 30 people to raise a child from neonate to adult. This means that we are nurturing. And it means that not just our women are nurturing, but our men are nurturing as well. That all three of the biological sexes that we have, because we do have three biological sexes, all three of these sexes are nurturing, and all three of them are required to nurture a child. And this goes into some of the stuff that we were talking earlier. When you nurture a child to what sings to them instead of into conforming to what you think they're supposed to do, that nurturing a child into what sings to them creates a benefit for the community as a whole, instead of forcing them into a space that it's not right, right? So if we are taking a child and we've decided that that child is female and so their only space is to sit at home next to the fire and tend it, yet they're really good at hunting, we're totally harming our community by not allowing this child to do what they're good at. Now, current studies show that women and men are both hunting in any prior society, that there are not the gender roles that we think of along those lines. So when we're looking at nurturing a child, hey, beautiful, my sissy's here. When we're looking at nurturing a child, we're looking at taking a child from neonate to adult, and it takes everybody in that community, whether or not you're teaching that child your skills to see what sings to it, right? Or whether or not you are, you know, whether or not you're providing food. Those are all things of nurturing, whether or not you're teaching, whether or not you're providing, whether or not you're just being there, whether or not you're telling stories, whether or not you're hearing. These are all methods of nurturing. We are, as a species, nurturing and communal. And currently, we live in a society that tells us that we're not allowed to nurture and we're not supposed to be communal. We live in a society that tells us that being nurturing is a problem, putting up spikes so homeless can't sleep, refusing to give food to people, hoarding. These are all things that are the antithesis of who we are biologically. And so as a result, many of us deal with a lot of depression and a lot of anxiety. Many of us are dealing with a lot of issue within our own head because we think we're the problem. We look at a society that is the antithesis to everything we need and everything we crave as a human being. And so, because we're sitting there going, God, I feel alone and I feel in pain and I feel all of these things, I must be the problem. You are not the problem. You are, in fact, having a healthy response to an unhealthy society. It is a healthy response to be depressed when you see babies dying. It's a healthy response to be hurt when you see other people hurting. That's empathy and compassion. It is something that is really a huge part of who we are. These are healthy responses to an unhealthy situation. So when you are having the healthy response to the unhealthy situation, it is you who are the solution, not the problem. And I state this because it is only those of us who wake up, who can see the problems for what they are, who can affect change. You cannot affect change if you cannot see the change that needs to be happening. If you think that all humans are innately evil, then you can't see that all humans are innately nurturing, right? If you think that you're innately something, you can't work against it. That's just who I am, right? So when we believe that what we've been indoctrinated into is the truth, and we spend this time watching a society that is sick, that is ill, that is problematic, and we feel pain and depression and anxiety and hurt for others and compassion and empathy, and we think that we're the problem. And we sink into this thought process of depression because we must be the problem because we're not fitting in well enough to this society. I need you to understand that you are not the problem, you are the solution. It is only by seeing, it is only by realizing, it is only by understanding that you can affect change. We cannot affect change if we do not see the problem. So, currently living in this extremely unhealthy society, your natural healthy reactions are depression and anxiety and pain. So please hold yourself in grace, hold others in grace. Remember that that is natural, that it is actually problematic if you're not feeling depressed when you watch babies getting killed. If you don't feel empathy and compassion for children being murdered, then you are the problem. Then you need to go to a counselor because you probably have a significant psychological disorder. Thank you. So, when we are sitting here, like most of us who are innately nurturing and innately communal, like our species as a whole, and we're dealing with this pain and we're dealing with this depression, I want you to give yourself grace. I ask you to give yourself grace. I ask you to remember that we are all worthy just by breathing. Of course, when we contribute, our worth goes up. Absolutely. But your worth is not what you can be exploited for. Your worth is not what somebody can exploit out of you as they are forcing you to work for no pay or low pay, and you can't even afford to feed yourself. Being exploitable does not make you worthy. Breathing makes you worthy. We are worthy because we are human and we are alive. That's all you need is to be human and to be alive to be worthy. Remember that you are worthy and give yourself grace, give yourself love, and take care of yourself in this depression. How to end the exploitation is a huge question. And we talk about this usually, and we talked about this a little bit more, but the answer to all of this, to my mind, and I know that there are other answers out there, but the answer to all of this, to my mind, is land back on a global scale. Returning, tending, and governance to Indigenous people on a global scale will get rid of the colonized, indoctrinated thought process. It will teach us reciprocity. It will teach us community. And by learning community and learning reciprocity, we can find an end to the exploitation, right? If we can get away from this thought process that tells you that this is not your home, you're not a co creator of the good green earth, you are here in exile on your way to your real home in heaven, as we were just reading. If you can get rid of that thought process, you can get this thought process further. Yes, and we actually were talking about this earlier. Many Indigenous groups do have gender roles. Gender roles, typically within an animistic culture, though, are fluid. Not only that, most animistic cultures and most Indigenous cultures have more than two, right? And if I, as somebody who presents to the world as female, have more of a tendency to hunt, have more of a tendency to do things that fit into what gender role might be termed as masculine, it is more capable for me to fluidly fit into that. Maybe I become a two spirit, which I am, or maybe maybe in my community you just switch genders, right? And what it is when we believe that gender roles are set by your biology instead of understanding that gender roles have to do with who you are, with what is innate to you, with how you nurture, with how things sing to you, with what you are drawn to, right? Then that is where the problem comes in. Gender roles and having gender, though, is absolutely something that we see in many different spaces. Gender is something that we see in many different spaces. What we do not see in many different, especially Indigenous spaces, is in the idea that your gender role is set by somebody else and your gender role precludes you from being able to do the things that you're actually good at. In most Indigenous societies where I might be viewed as female, if my things that I am good at, I'm really good at hunting. I've always been really good at hunting. I'm really good at building. I've always been really good at building. If those things are considered to be more of the masculine gender role, they're not things that are denied to me just because I look like I'm a woman. It's understood that I fit better within that gender role. That's where the toxicity doesn't lie. The toxicity lies in the thought process that because I perceive you as a man, the only thing you can do is work at a job and provide money for me. That's where the toxicity comes in, right? The toxicity comes in by denying the human behind the role, right? So when we are, yeah, yeah. And it does. It works both ways. And it must be understood. It must be understood. And we've stated it a few times in here, but we'll state it again. It must be understood that these things are not toxic just to the victims. They are toxic to the perpetrators, right? So if your gender role that is designed by society is you have a penis and therefore you're a man, that means that what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to go out and work all day long at a hard job and come home and do nothing because you've brought in money. Whereas it would be healthier for you mentally if your value wasn't based on whether or not you were providing dollar signs to somebody else. It would be healthier for you if it was okay to be lovingly interactive with your kids. It would be healthier for you if it was okay to have feelings and talk to other people, right? So these things don't just harm the victims, they harm the people who are doing them too, right? Because when we are denied our humanity because we have to fit into somebody else's idea, we become exploitable, we become objects, and we don't sing to who we are. I haven't blocked a single person in this live. And if your comment was inappropriate, you get to be blocked. TikTok gives everybody with 1,000 followers a live space. This is my space. It's my home. I set the rules. You set the rules and the boundaries in your home. That's appropriate and respectable, valid. I set the rules and my boundaries in my home. That's appropriate, that's respectable, and that's valid. If you are crossing the boundaries that I have set in my space, then my moderators are going to block you because I have boundaries and boundaries are appropriate. Any idea that somebody shouldn't have boundaries is your indoctrination, colonization, and your white supremacy. It's an extremely fucked up mental state of being that you think that you can run over other people's boundaries. Boundaries are appropriate. Only narcissistic thought process states that somebody else isn't allowed boundaries. And I don't deal with narcissistic abuse in this chat. I go by auntie or more. More is the Swedish word for mother. Your mother's mother is your more. So my grandchildren and my adopted children call me more. Yeah, just come into somebody's room and tell them what they're supposed to do. So when we are dealing with this extensive depression and anxiety that the vast amount of us are dealing with because we are not able to nurture, because we are not able to be a part of community. Community is such a huge thing that we are all really denied right now, right? And because we do not have the nurture and the community that we need, that innately we need, biologically we need, many of us are dealing with the mental health fallout over it. And I just want you to remember today that that's a healthy response to an unhealthy situation. It's a healthy response. Love yourself. It's okay. It's okay to hurt when you see other people hurting, right? And it's not only okay, it's right. Like if you don't hurt when you see other people hurting, that's a lack of compassion, right? Oh, I'm so sorry. That's really hard. I have a couple of friends actually who have gone through that very recently. I was talking to one last night, and it's so hard, right? Um, it's a really hard thing to deal with. May their time with the ancestors be brighter than their time here, and may your healing be full and swift. It is very difficult to deal with. Global change happens when enough people reach that tipping point, when enough people's brains is changed, right? If I can reach 27,000 and each of those 27,000 reaches 10, right? Global change happens when our thought process of the way it works changes on a global scale, and we're working. We're getting there, right? There are a lot of people in the world who are sitting here going, "That's enough. It's not enough. We're not doing this anymore." You're the one melting, dragon, not me. You're the one crying, not me. You're the one going into somebody's space who is speaking in a calm, educated manner and throwing a toddler pissy fit. Communism is better than capitalism every day of the week. It's in the word. Though we've never seen communism since 1492, not true communism. What we've seen is capitalism couched as communism, just like we've seen fascism, which is capitalism couched as fascism. It's all capitalism. It's all been capitalism for 10,000 years at this point. Anything that falls under Western thought process. So with that, the reminder is that we are all nurturing and communal biologically, scientifically, and that the depression that you're dealing with is because you're seeing it. And you are necessary, because it is that seeing that gets us to the next step. And we are all worthy. See you later, love. We are all worthy. Just by breathing, you have worth. You do not need to be exploitable by somebody else to be worthy. You are worthy just by breathing. You are worthy just by being alive. And you are necessary just by being alive. More so, if you can actually see what's going on and you're awake to it and you want to make sure that there is safer space for people, that children aren't dying, that children aren't starving, that people have houses, that people are safe and aware. Land back on a global scale returns us to a thought process of reciprocity, returns us to a thought process of community. Land back does not mean get out. And I need to always double down on that because so many people take it there. But nobody who's asking for land back takes it there. Land back means tending and governance to Indigenous communities, of which there are many on a global scale in many different countries across the planet. Their understanding of community, their understanding of reciprocity, and their understanding of the land that they are Indigenous to is a necessary thing for the space that we are at now. We are currently in our climate destruction and our hubris causing our own mass extinction. Now, climate change happens. We have cycles of climate change. Climate destruction is something that Western-based agriculture has been causing for 10,000 years from its very first inception. Land back means the ability for people to govern and tend their land in the way they're supposed to. It does not mean get out. It means listen. It means learn reciprocity. It means learn the responsibility that comes with rights. It means learn community and interaction. It means being guided in these things by people who understand these things. So it does not mean get out. I always have to make sure I double down on that. That is the answer to my mind. That is, to me, what we need on a global scale. Now, I'm not right all the time. I don't know everything. I'm not even trying to know everything. I've only got specific areas that I study deeply. So there might be other ideas, other ways, right? I think we're already seeing meaningful change in our time. There are countries in this world who have thrown out their colonizers, right? I think we're already seeing meaningful change. I think that we need much, much more if we want to survive as a species, right? Because we're killing ourselves off. We're not killing the planet, we're killing us. We need much, much more if we want to survive as a species, and very quickly if we want to survive as a species. But I do believe that it is already happening on a global scale. Yeah, I think I went over everything. Remember that you're nurturing and communal, and that your depression and your anxiety is a natural response to an unhealthy society, and that land back is absolutely the way. Returning tending and governance. Hi, Jake. I'm going to go ahead and take off, and I will be back. If you have not already, that right there, the at Sarah Orm or at Sarah Widda is my other account on TikTok. In case I'm no longer on this account on TikTok. Sorry, it is over, and they're always over on YouTube. If I end up no longer on TikTok because of the genocide plus people who are positive that genocide is the way to go, there are other spaces to find me. Again, there is the widdaord.com website, which gives you links to many different places that I am at. There is the other account here on TikTok, and there is my YouTube. I say this because we're currently facing the genocide positive group who is, pro killing kids, all of my lives are on YouTube at the same time. The YouTube is usually up there. It's just Widda Ord on YouTube. So you can go on YouTube and find this live. You can find all of my past lives, pretty much all of my past lives on YouTube. And I record them at the same time. I've got like a little camera sitting right here on my screen, and I record them at the same time so that you can watch from there. You can often comment there if the comments are turned off here, and you can rewatch them there because it's hard to right. So remember your love today. Hold yourself in grace today. Take care of yourself today. It is a painful world right now. Take care of yourself today. Um, do not think that you have to watch things you can't. Do not think that you have to. Uh, you really are true. Just like really, really, really in there. You're so melty and you're so demanding and you're so throwing a toddler tantrum. It's really kind of cute, except for I'm sure you're an adult. Um, I was asked last night, you're not watching any of this, are you? Because the person that asked me is another veteran and knows that I'm a war veteran. And I'm like, no, I'm not watching any of it. I know what's going on and I will read some of it, but I am not watching any of it. You don't have to watch what's going on to know what's going on. You do not have to traumatize yourself. And I want people to remember that. It does no benefit to anybody for you to traumatize yourself. Right? We should know things that are happening. We should know things that are happening, but you do not have to watch death and destruction. Do not traumatize yourself. I'm not saying don't watch it. What I'm saying is if you are somebody who has trauma, who gets triggered by these kind of things, you do not have to sit there and watch it. If you don't know what's going on, if you don't know the things that have happened in the history of this world, if you don't know the things that have happened in the history here, if you don't know the things that have happened over there, you should absolutely be watching it, right? You should absolutely see these things if you do not know, if you have not, been in the middle of these kind of things, right? But if you are somebody who, it's like, if you come from an extremely abusive family, watching children be abused will send you into a state where you can't function. If you come from a war zone, watching a war zone will send you into a state where you cannot function. If you come from a history of genocide as an indigenous person coming from a history of genocide, watching genocide can be extremely traumatic. I watch indigenous films on indigenous subjects of the genocide because I hold space for indigenous people and uplift indigenous voices. I also will not watch things that are extremely violent, even about indigenous genocide. I know what has happened. I don't need to watch it and I don't need to re-traumatize myself from my ancestors, right? So it is not me stating don't. What it is if you have a place that you come from where trauma is huge for you, right? Where it is one of those things that you've lived through it. If you're going and you're watching the trauma, it will it will trigger you. It will put you in a space that you need counseling, right? And what I'm stating is don't put yourself in a space where you're going to be unable to function, is what I am stating, right? That doesn't mean don't be aware. You can be aware fully without watching it. Newspapers, not American and not Israeli, right? 1440, I think, is a good thing. There's a couple of different spaces. Going and researching the actual history and getting some decent information on it. All of those things you can do without having to watch the trauma, right? You should absolutely educate yourself on what is happening, and you should absolutely hold space for honoring people who are being harmed. It is not holding space to honor people being harmed by watching people being blown up. Holding space to honor people being harmed is sitting in a space and sending energy and love, right? And healing, right? And holding space in your heart. It is not forcing yourself to watch atrocity and be triggered. And that's what I'm stating. I am not stating ignore it on any level. And I am not stating don't educate yourself on it. I have actually educated myself extensively on the situation in the last 2 weeks. The reasoning is I knew a lot of the stuff, but there are things I didn't know. I didn't know where Abraham was from. I didn't know where Shem was from. I didn't know who the Canaanites' descendants were. I had to go and do extensive research. I didn't know how Israel took land from Palestine. I didn't know that. I had to go and do extensive research. That's all the last 2 weeks of research, right? Now, I knew the history of the area. I knew the history of Islam. I knew the history of the church. I knew the history of Judaism. I knew many of these things, but I didn't know many of these details. So going and researching, going and understanding and creating a better understanding, which you can absolutely do without watching children getting harmed, right? So I am not saying do not be aware. I am not saying do not study it. I'm not saying do not do your research. I'm not saying do not know. I am stating don't trigger yourself to a point that you are curled up in a ball in a corner and nobody's getting any function out of you, including you. That is only harmful for yourself and it does not help anybody else, right? It is only harming you. Now you can't help anybody. If you are so triggered in a corner, you're not bringing awareness to anybody else. If you're so triggered, you're in a corner, maybe you have the ability that you can send aid. But if you're triggered in a corner, you can't send aid nowhere, right? If you're so triggered in a corner, you're not functioning. Not only are you not able to help other people, but you're not able to help yourself and you're not able to help the people next to you, right? So absolutely awareness, absolutely understanding, absolutely do a lot of research, do a lot of digging, right? You can do all of those things without having to be triggered by watching children being harmed. I can't even watch animals being harmed. Like I don't even watch shit like that because it triggers me, right? Because for me, that's, family. So there's just a lot within it, right? So definitely look, but don't trigger yourself. And that's part of that holding grace. And that's part of self-care is activism. Many of us don't know that, right? Self-care is activism. Taking care of yourself so that you can continue to be active is activism, right? If I don't take care of myself, I can't be on the streets every night, right? If I'm not making sure every day that I am taken care of, then I can't go out that night, right? Self-care is activism, and that is a huge part of that self-care is activism. You must take care of self too to be able to be capable to take care of anybody else, to be able to be capable to make any change, to be able to be capable to hold space, to be able to be capable to give love. You have to take care of yourself, right? So yes, absolute research. Do not sit there and watch all this stuff if it's going to leave you in a ball in a corner, right? Trauma porn isn't necessary. And sometimes that's what it is trauma porn for some people, right? It's not necessary. It is absolutely okay to be very well aware of what is going on and not have to watch any of it, right? Which all falls back to give yourself grace, take care of yourself, because you can't change anything. You can't affect anything. You can't do anything if you are not taking care of yourself and giving yourself grace, because you are worthy, necessary just by breathing. And if you forget that you are worthy and necessary just by breathing and you don't give yourself the worth that you are, right? Worthy people are worthy of a shower. When you're worthy of eating. When you're worthy of sitting somewhere. I pray that Israel stops their genocide against the Palestinians. I pray that Israel realizes that the God of all three, the God of the Palestinians and the God of Israel, is the same God. And that God of genocide, death, and destruction is not okay. And I pray with all of my heart that Israel stops the genocide. I pray with all of my heart that Israel stops killing children. I pray from the bottom of my heart. Please pray for Israel. Please pray that Israel stops killing people. Please pray for Israel to stop a genocide. Pray with all of your heart. Absolutely. Give yourself grace. Remember that you're loved. Take care of yourself. Take care of each other. And I will be back. Maybe. Remember, I might be gone. But take care of yourself. And I'll see you later. Have a great one, everybody. Pray to end the Israeli occupation. Absolutely. We should absolutely pray to end the Israeli occupation, especially since Israel pays Hamas. See you later, YouTube. You all take care of each other. Much love to you guys. I see that there's like 3 of you there. I'll be back soon. If I'm not able to be back on TikTok, I'll definitely be back on here. Have a great one, everybody.